Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we invite you to settle in for the story of Rosario Sal Gambino, a man who didn't rule the streets with gunfire or headlines, but with shipping manifests, whispered phone calls, and pizza boxes that carried something far more dangerous than food. To the public, he was invisible. To law enforcement, just another quiet Sicilian name lost in paperwork. But behind the ovens and storefronts, Sal Gambino stood at the center of the largest heroin network in American Mafia history, a global pipeline stretching from the hills of Sicily to the streets of New York. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? We love watching this underworld expand across countries, across time zones, across sleepless nights. And if you find comfort in slow, cinematic crime stories like this, stories meant to be felt, not rushed, consider subscribing to Outlaw Icons. It helps this channel grow quietly and ensures you never miss another descent into the shadows. Now, take a deep breath. Let the noise of the day fade away. Let the streets grow quiet, the ovens cool, and the whispers begin. Tonight, we follow the trail no one was supposed to see. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, Bloodlines from Sicily. The night the decision was sealed, the sea off Palermo was black and still, as if it already knew what was about to cross it. Somewhere above the water, a radio hummed softly, carrying voices that never used names. Men leaned in close, not because the wind demanded it, but because habit did. A life was being positioned, not launched, and the difference mattered. Long before New York would learn the name Sal Gambino, Sicily had already weighed him, measured him, and quietly approved. Power here did not arrive with shouting. It arrived like stone laid on stone. Palermo breathed it in its courtyards and exhaled it through shuttered windows. In Sicily, the hills watched over families who counted time in generations, not years. The air smelled of salt, citrus, and memory. Children learned early which doors to knock on and which to pass without looking. Men learned earlier still that blood was not just family. It was currency. The Gambinos did not rise from hunger alone. Hunger makes men reckless. This was something colder. Their roots were braided into Sicily's soil, tied by marriages arranged like treaties, by debts inherited the way others inherit land. To be born into it was to be born owing something, even before you understood what payment meant. The old men called it tradition. The young men felt it as gravity. In Palermo's narrow streets, the Inzerillo name carried weight without volume. It moved quietly through bakeries and back rooms, through weddings where smiles were sincere and promises were permanent. They were not loud men. They did not need to be. Their strength came from patience, from knowing when to wait and when to act, from understanding that the longest games were the safest ones. When they married into the Gambino line, it was not romance. It was architecture. Sal was born into this structure, not asked whether he wanted it. Childhood did not offer innocence so much as instruction. He watched adults speak in half sentences, saw arguments end without winners, learned that silence could be more dangerous than anger. Fear was present, but it was disciplined. Pride, too. You carried yourself a certain way because anything less embarrassed the dead. The old world taught lessons the new world would never see. Loyalty was not declared. It was tested quietly over time. A favor returned too quickly meant desperation. Return too late meant disrespect. Balance mattered. Everything had a rhythm, like the tide pulling back before it surged. When Sal listened, he learned where that rhythm came from. Stories traveled faster than people. Tales of America drifted through cafes like smoke. A place where money moved quicker, where distance could blur old grudges, where a man could be useful in new ways. But America was not escape. It was extension. The sea between Sicily and New York was not a wall. It was a corridor. The Inzerillos understood this before most. They saw opportunity the way farmers see weather, not as luck, but as pattern. Connections in Sicily could protect shipments. Connections in America could protect silence. Together, they could create something larger than either side alone. It was not yet called anything. Names come later. First comes trust. Sal listened when others talked. He remembered who flinched and who didn't. He learned that violence was not strength, only punctuation. The real sentence was written in patience, in logistics, in relationships that could survive distance. He learned to think in routes instead of streets, in years instead of nights. In Sicily, funerals were as important as weddings. Both revealed who mattered. Sal watched who stood closest to the family and who lingered near the walls. He noticed who spoke and who nodded. These were not manners. They were maps. And Sal was learning how to read them. When the elders spoke of obligations, they did not mean money. They meant memory. Who helped whose father? Who sheltered whose cousin? Who kept quiet when it would have been easier to talk? These debts did not expire. They waited. And one day, they would be collected, gently or not. America loomed closer with every conversation. The decision was never announced. It simply became inevitable. Sal did not ask if he was ready. Readiness was assumed. A suitcase was packed with care, not clothes. What mattered could not be folded. What mattered crossed oceans in the mind. On the night before he left, the sea was calm again. The same black water, the same soft radio. The men were quieter now. No advice was offered. Advice implied doubt. Instead, there were looks, small gestures, a hand on a shoulder that lingered a second longer than necessary. It said everything without saying anything at all. Sal understood then that he was not leaving Sicily behind. He was carrying it with him, stitched into his name, weighted in his blood. America would think it was meeting a man. It was meeting a lineage. The boat pulled away before dawn. Lights receded. The hills became shapes, then shadows, then nothing. Somewhere ahead waited a city that would never sleep, a place loud enough to mistake silence for weakness. Sal watched the horizon and said nothing. He had already learned the most important lesson. Some power announces itself. Other power travels quietly, wrapped in tradition, guided by obligation, and patient enough to wait decades before revealing its purpose. As the sea opened in front of him, Sal Gambino did not know the name that history would give what came next. But the blood that carried him forward already did. And far across the water, in a city built on noise, something ancient was about to arrive without making a sound. The old men never spoke about fear directly, but it lived in the pauses between their words. Fear was not the enemy. Exposure was. In Sicily, everyone understood the difference. Fear kept you alert. Exposure killed you. Sal learned to measure both by watching how conversations ended. The ones that ended too cleanly were the most dangerous. At night, Palermo softened. Daytime rules bent under lamplight. The city seemed to breathe slower, giving space for things that could not exist in daylight. It was then that Sal absorbed the deeper logic of his world. Authority was not issued. It accumulated. Like dust on a shelf no one ever wiped clean, it settled where it was allowed to remain undisturbed. The Inzerillos had mastered that stillness. They understood that being seen was a tax, and being remembered was a liability. Their strength was in becoming part of the background. Shopkeepers greeted them with the same tone they used for everyone else, and that sameness was the point. It meant safety. It meant order. Family gatherings carried another education. Children ran between tables, unaware that the adults were conducting inventories of trust with every laugh and glance. A joke told at the wrong moment could echo for years. A silence held at the right moment could earn protection no contract could guarantee. Sal watched these moments pile up, small stones building a wall. Marriage sealed more than love. It sealed alignment. When a Gambino married an Inzerillo, it fused two histories into one future. Arguments became internal. Enemies became shared. Bloodlines braided tighter, and with them, expectations. Sal felt those expectations even when no one voiced them. They followed him like a shadow that always stayed the same length. Across the island, rumors traveled faster than boats. There were whispers of changing times, of younger men who wanted more visibility, more profit, more noise. The elders frowned at this. Noise attracted storms. Sal listened to these whispers and filed them away. Change was coming. It always did. The question was who would survive it. America was spoken about with restraint. Too much excitement would have revealed need. Instead, it was discussed like weather on the horizon. Inevitable. Neutral. Necessary. The Inzerillos knew their value there would be in what they could move without being seen. Sicily could refine things. America could consume them. Between the two lay the sea, and the sea did not care. Sal was tested in small ways before he ever left. A message delivered without comment. A question answered without curiosity. Each success earned less praise than the last. Praise was another form of exposure. When nothing was said, Sal knew he had done it correctly. There were moments, rare and brief, when doubts surfaced. Not doubt about the path, but about the cost. Sal wondered what part of himself would have to stay behind to make the crossing possible. He did not share this with anyone. Questions were for men who planned to stay children. The night before departure stretched longer than it should have. Sleep came in fragments. The radio murmured again, the same low hum, as if looping a message only the sea understood. Sal stood alone once more, watching the water, aware that every step forward would pull something old tighter around his chest. Sicily does not release its sons easily. It marks them. It teaches them to carry the past as armor and burden at once. Sal felt that weight settle as the shoreline faded. What he was carrying could not be declared at customs. It could not be searched or seized. It lived behind his eyes, in his patience, in his refusal to hurry. Ahead waited a city that rewarded speed and punished hesitation. A place where alliances shifted faster than tides, where men confused loudness for strength. Sal did not plan to correct them. He planned to let them believe it. Because while America was busy listening for noise, something old and disciplined was already crossing the water. And when it arrived, it would not announce itself. It would simply begin. The sea closed behind him without ceremony. No one waved. No promises were made. Only the quiet understanding that what began in Sicily would not end there. As the horizon swallowed the last light, Sal Gambino moved forward carrying a future already written, toward a city unprepared for how softly power could arrive. History would not notice the moment, but it would forget it. Chapter 2. The Inzerillo, Gambino Alliance. By the time Sal Gambino reached American soil, the alliance that would shape his life had already been forged in whispers, not signatures. It did not begin with a meeting in a back room or a handshake sealed over wine. It began years earlier, in Sicily, when men realized that survival no longer belonged to those who ruled territory, but to those who could move unseen between worlds. The old structure was cracking, not collapsing, not yet, but shifting under its own weight. The island had always been a place of power, but power had learned to travel. Ships came and went. Cargo disappeared and reappeared in different forms. What once stayed local now crossed borders with ease. Those who failed to adapt became legends. Those who adapted became ghosts. The Inzerillos were never kings of the street. They did not need to be. Their strength lay in connection, not domination. Where others built empires that demanded visibility, they built systems that demanded discretion. Their homes were modest, their voices calm. Their reputation traveled farther than they ever did. That reputation reached the Gambinos long before Sal understood what his last name truly meant. The Gambino family, on the other hand, had already taken root in America. Their name carried weight in New York's underworld, spoken carefully and rarely. They controlled territory, unions, businesses that looked legitimate enough to survive daylight. But America was changing. Law enforcement was learning. Surveillance was improving. The streets were getting louder, and noise drew attention. What the Gambinos needed was not more muscle. They had plenty of that. What they needed was distance. A way to move the most dangerous business away from the eyes that were always watching. They needed partners who could handle the most delicate work without leaving fingerprints behind. Sicily offered that solution. The Inzerillos understood something the Americans did not yet fully grasp. Drugs were not a street racket. They were logistics. They were chemistry, routes, timing, trust. They required patience, not temper. The Inzerillos had spent generations perfecting patience. The first conversations were indirect. Questions posed as observations. Compliments delivered as warnings. Men tested one another not with threats, but with restraint. Who spoke too much? Who spoke too little? Who listened? Who remembered? Trust was not built by agreement. It was built by silence that held. Sal watched these dynamics unfold without being invited into them. That was the test. Inclusion too early meant weakness. He learned instead by observation, by being present without demanding recognition. In Sicily, the loudest man in the room was often the least important. Sal made himself quiet. The alliance was never announced. There was no ceremony, no spoken aloud. It took form through marriages that bound families tighter than contracts ever could. Through shared funerals, shared secrets, shared enemies. Each connection reinforced the next, until disentangling them would have required tearing apart entire bloodlines. In practical terms, the deal was simple. Sicily would control production and initial movement. America would handle distribution and money. But simplicity was deceptive. Each side needed assurance that the other would not panic under pressure. Panic was contagious. Panic killed operations. The Inzerillos brought something else to the table. They brought credibility. In Sicily, they had access to routes that had existed for centuries, paths once used for olive oil and citrus now repurposed for something far more profitable. They knew which ports were lazy, which inspectors could be predicted, which schedules repeated themselves like habits. They understood that the best hiding place was familiarity. The Gambinos, for their part, offered insulation. If something went wrong, the distance between Sicily and New York created delay, confusion, opportunity. By the time law enforcement realized where to look, the trail had already cooled. Responsibility could be blurred. Blame could be shifted. Silence could be maintained. Sal began to understand his role slowly, the way one understands the rules of a new language by listening before speaking. He was not there to command. He was there to connect, to translate expectation into action without creating friction. His value was not in force, but in reliability. There were early failures, small shipments lost, money delayed, questions raised. These moments were watched carefully, not to assign blame, but to measure response. Did anyone rush to explain? Did anyone overcorrect? Did anyone disappear? Sal learned that the correct response was steadiness. Problems acknowledged without drama. Solutions proposed without ego. Fear lived in these moments, but it was disciplined fear, the kind that sharpened attention rather than clouded it. Sal felt it when a shipment went silent longer than expected, when a message arrived incomplete, when a face at a meeting seemed unfamiliar. He learned to let fear inform him, not control him. The alliance deepened through repetition. Success breeds trust, but only if success remains boring. Boring meant safe. Each uneventful transfer strengthened the bond. Each problem solved quietly reinforced the belief that this system could outlast scrutiny. Sal noticed how differently Americans spoke about power. They liked titles, hierarchies, visible authority. In Sicily, power preferred to be mistaken for absence. The Inzerillos carried that philosophy with them, and Sal absorbed it fully. If someone knew who you were already exposed. The Americans were beginning to attract attention. Their names appeared in papers, their habits documented, their patterns studied. Sal understood that the alliance was not just profitable. It was necessary. It allowed the Gambinos to continue operating without becoming the obvious target. At dinners, conversations drifted toward the future, not spoken directly, but hinted at. Law enforcement would grow smarter. Borders would tighten. Technology would advance. The alliance had to evolve ahead of pressure, not behind it. Sal listened. He remembered. He adjusted. There was pride in this work, though it was never called that. Pride in competence. Pride in restraint. Pride in knowing that others depended on your calm. Sal carried that pride carefully. Too much of it could become arrogance. Too little could become doubt. He began to move more frequently between worlds. Sicily and America. tradition, and innovation. He became a vessel through which expectations passed. He did not personalize criticism. He did not celebrate praise. Both were distractions. The Inzerillos trusted him because he did not rush to be trusted. The Gambinos trusted him because he did not ask to be elevated. His value grew precisely because he treated it as invisible. The alliance did more than move goods. It reshaped power. Decisions made in Sicily now echoed in New York. Decisions made in New York rippled back across the sea. Neither side fully controlled the other. That balance was intentional. Control breeds resentment. Partnership breeds obligation. Sal felt the weight of that obligation daily. Every message carried consequence. Every delay carried risk. Every success carried expectation. He learned to sleep lightly, to wake without alarm, to exist in a state of constant readiness without appearing tense. At times, he wondered if the alliance could survive the pressures that would inevitably come. Law enforcement was not static. Neither was human weakness. Greed could corrode even the strongest structures. Sal understood that systems failed not from attack, but from impatience. He watched for signs of impatience. A man asking for more too quickly. A man taking credit too openly. A man reacting emotionally to minor setbacks. These were fractures forming beneath the surface. Sal logged them mentally, not to exploit, but to prepare. The alliance endured because it adapted. Routes changed. Methods evolved. Communication refined. What remained constant was the philosophy. Silence before speed. Stability before profit. Distance before dominance. Sal became more than a participant. He became a safeguard. Someone both sides trusted to maintain equilibrium. He did not see this as power. He saw it as responsibility. Responsibility carried less ego, more burden. There were nights when he missed Sicily in ways that surprised him. Not the place, but the clarity. In Sicily, everyone understood the rules. In America, rules shifted constantly. Appearances mattered more. Words were louder. Consequences sometimes arrived unpredictably. Sal learned to navigate this chaos without absorbing it. The alliance entered a new phase as scale increased. What had once been manageable grew complex. Complexity bred vulnerability. Sal responded by simplifying where possible. Fewer points of contact. Fewer names spoken. Fewer explanations given. The fewer moving parts, the fewer things could break. The elders noticed this. Not with compliments, but with expanded trust. Sal was given more responsibility without announcement. More discretion without instruction. He understood what this meant. It meant there was no longer room for error. He did not celebrate this moment. He internalized it. Leadership, he had learned, was often invisible to the one carrying it. As years passed, the alliance hardened into something resilient. It survived internal disputes. It survived external pressure. It survived the egos that destroyed others. Sal remained steady at its center, a quiet constant in a system designed to avoid attention. But beneath the surface, something else was forming. The alliance had created efficiency. Efficiency attracts volume. Volume attracts risk. Sal sensed this shift before anyone named it. The system was becoming too successful, too smooth, too reliable. Success changes behavior. It breeds confidence. Confidence invites exposure. Sal felt this tension growing, like pressure beneath a sealed container. He did not yet know how it would release. He only knew that it would. The sea between Sicily and America continued to shrink, not physically, but operationally. What once took months now took weeks. What once required explanation now required only a nod. The alliance had reached maturity. And maturity, Sal understood, was often the moment before consequences. He stood one evening watching ships move in the distance, lights blinking like signals meant for someone else. The air smelled different here than in Sicily. Less history, more urgency. Sal did not feel nostalgia. He felt anticipation. Because alliances, like bloodlines, do not exist without purpose. They move towards something. And whatever this alliance was building, whatever it was preparing to move, was no longer abstract. It was becoming real. And once it did, There would be no turning back. Chapter 3. From Palermo to Brooklyn. The first thing Sal Gambino noticed about Brooklyn was the noise. Not the sharp kind, not shouting or sirens, but a constant low rumble, like the city itself was breathing too fast. In Sicily, silence carried meaning. Here, silence was suspicious. Brooklyn did not wait. It pushed forward, crowded, impatient, layered with voices speaking over one another. Sal understood immediately that this place rewarded motion, but punished carelessness. He arrived without ceremony. No crowd, no welcome, just a name written on a piece of paper, an address memorized, and then destroyed. The port smelled of oil and rust and salt, familiar enough to be comforting, different enough to demand attention. He did not look back. Looking back was for men who planned to return. Sal did not know if return was part of his future. He only knew that what he carried could not afford nostalgia. The neighborhood absorbed him without noticing. That was good. Brooklyn had always been a place where new faces arrived daily, each one believing they were invisible. Sal understood the difference between being unseen and being unimportant. He intended to remain the first while becoming the second to as few people as possible. The streets felt tighter than Sicily, but louder. Buildings pressed in close, stacked stories high, as if everyone was leaning in to listen. Conversations spilled from doorways, from stoops, from open windows. English tangled with Italian, with dialects softened by distance and time. Sal listened more than he spoke. Accents revealed history. Pauses revealed caution. He stayed with relatives at first, distant connections bound by obligation rather than affection. There were rules even here. No questions asked. No explanations given. Meals eaten together, but discussions kept shallow. This was not mistrust. It was hygiene. Sal respected it. Brooklyn was not Sicily. Power did not announce itself with lineage alone. It announced itself through access. Who could get you work? Who could make a problem disappear? Who could connect you to someone else without creating debt? Sal observed how men navigated this terrain, how favors were requested indirectly, how refusals were delivered politely enough to avoid insult, but firmly enough to end discussion. He noticed something else quickly. In America, ambition was loud. Men wanted to be seen rising. They wanted recognition, titles, visibility. In Sicily, ambition hid behind tradition. Here, it stepped into the light. Sal understood the danger in that immediately. The Gambino name carried weight, but it was not spoken casually. Those who mattered already knew it. Those who did not were not meant to hear it. Sal learned when to let his name work for him and when to leave it untouched. Used too often, it would attract attention. Used too rarely, it would lose meaning. He was introduced slowly, carefully, always through someone else. No direct approaches, no self-promotion. His presence was explained as necessity, not ambition. A relative visiting, someone helping with coordination, a quiet man who knew how to listen. That last description mattered most. Brooklyn's underworld had its own rhythm, different from Sicily's, but governed by similar instincts. Respect mattered, but respect here was transactional. You earned it by solving problems. Sal watched how problems moved. Who created them? Who resolved them? Who benefited quietly when others argued loudly? He took small roles at first, tasks that required precision, not authority, relaying information, translating expectations between people who spoke the same language but meant different things. These were not glamorous responsibilities. They were revealing ones. Sal learned that American crime was compartmentalized. One man controlled unions. Another controlled trucks. Another controlled numbers. Everything was segmented to limit exposure. Sicily preferred overlap, redundancy. Brooklyn preferred distance. Sal understood both systems and saw the cracks in each. The neighborhood was full of men who mistook familiarity for safety. They ate at the same places, sat in the same chairs, spoke too freely among faces they assumed were loyal. Sal did not criticize this behavior. He simply noted it. Familiarity was efficient. It was also predictable. He avoided predictability. He walked different routes, changed routines, ate when others were finished, listened while others talked. When he spoke, It was measured, rarely offering opinion unless asked. When asked, he answered directly. No stories. No embellishment. Fear was different here. In Sicily, fear was communal. In Brooklyn, it was individual. Men feared being replaced, exposed, forgotten. That fear drove decisions. It made men reckless. Sal recognized this and adjusted his expectations accordingly. The Gambino family observed him quietly. No tests announced. No challenges issued. They watched how he handled frustration, how he responded to disrespect, real or perceived, how he navigated moments where ego would have been easier than patience. Sal passed these tests by not recognizing them as tests. He treated irritation as noise, insults as distractions. He focused instead on outcomes. Did the task get done? Did the problem resolve? Did anyone talk afterward? If the answer to the last question was no, he considered it success. He began to notice how Sicily's influence was both valued and resented. Valued for its discipline, resented for its distance. Americans liked control. Sicily offered autonomy. Balancing the two required diplomacy, not dominance. Sal found himself increasingly positioned as that balance. He did not demand authority. Authority found him. Slowly, without announcement, people began to defer to his judgment in matters that crossed boundaries. Shipments, timing, communication. These were not street-level decisions. They were structural ones. Sal understood that Brooklyn was not the destination. It was a junction. The real work happened between places. Between Sicily and America. Between suppliers and distributors. Between visibility and invisibility. He felt the weight of expectation grow. Not spoken, but implied. The alliance established in Sicily now required maintenance here. Sal became one of its custodians. Custodianship was not glamorous. It meant absorbing pressure quietly so others could remain loud. There were moments of loneliness. Not the absence of people, but the absence of peers. Few men understood the full picture. Fewer still were allowed to. Sal carried knowledge that could not be shared without consequence. He learned to live with that isolation. Brooklyn nights felt longer than Sicilian ones. The city did not sleep. It watched. Sal found himself awake at odd hours, listening to traffic, thinking through routes, contingencies, relationships. He learned that insomnia was not weakness. It was preparation. The work expanded. More movement, more coordination, more responsibility. Sal adjusted his posture, his tone, his expectations. He did not rush growth. Growth that arrived too fast attracted attention. Attention brought questions. Questions brought exposure. He watched others rise and fall. Men who burned bright, then vanished. Arrested. Killed. Forgotten. Sal noted a pattern. Those men sought dominance. Sal sought durability. Brooklyn taught him pragmatism. Sicily had taught him tradition. Together, they shaped his approach. He did not cling to old ways simply because they were old. He did not embrace new ways simply because they were efficient. He selected what worked and discarded what did not. He began to see the outlines of something larger forming. Not yet named. Not yet visible. But the pieces were aligning. Routes stabilizing. Trust consolidating. Demand increasing. Sal sensed momentum building. Slow but undeniable. With momentum came risk. He felt it in conversations that lingered too long. In curiosity that edged toward intrusion. In questions framed too casually. Sal responded by tightening information. Fewer details. Smaller circles. More redundancy. He also learned to read American law enforcement indirectly. Not through contact, but through absence. Which streets suddenly felt empty. Which faces disappeared. Which rumors circulated. Brooklyn was noisy, but patterns emerged for those patient enough to observe. Sal remained patient. He understood that Brooklyn was teaching him something Sicily could not. How to operate within chaos without becoming chaotic. How to remain invisible in a place that rewarded spectacle. He found himself thinking less about where he came from and more about where things were heading. The alliance was no longer theoretical. It was operational. And Brooklyn was its proving ground. One evening, walking past a storefront glowing late into the night, Sal paused. Inside, Men laughed too loudly, celebrating something prematurely. He did not join them. He did not envy them. He felt instead a quiet certainty. This place would test everyone eventually, not with force, but with pressure, not with violence, but with exposure. Those who survived would not be the loudest or the strongest. They would be the ones who understood when to move and when to disappear. Sal continued walking. The noise followed him, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt like cover. Brooklyn had not noticed him arrive. That was exactly how he wanted it. Because the men who change systems rarely announce themselves. They position quietly. They learn. They adapt. And by the time the city realizes what has taken root, it is already too late to remove it without tearing itself apart. Sal Gambino did not come to Brooklyn to conquer it. He came to understand it. And understanding, he knew, was the first step toward control. Chapter 4. Heroin replaces the old rackets. The shift did not arrive with sirens or speeches. It crept in quietly, like a change in the weather that only seasoned men noticed at first. One day the streets felt the same. The next, something fundamental had tilted. Sal Gambino sensed it before anyone named it. The old rackets still paid, but they no longer promised the future. Numbers, unions, extortion, all of it felt suddenly heavy, slow, bound to places and faces that law enforcement already knew too well. The world was accelerating. The old machinery could not keep up. In Brooklyn, Sal watched men cling to traditions that had once made them powerful. He did not judge them. He understood attachment, but he also understood math. Risk and reward were drifting out of balance. Too much effort for too little insulation. Too many hands touching the same money. Too many voices repeating the same lies. The margins were shrinking. The exposure was growing. Heroin entered the conversation the way a shadow enters a room. Not announced, not celebrated, just present. It was spoken of obliquely, wrapped in euphemism and distance. The word itself carried weight. It was different from everything else. Gambling took hope. Extortion took fear. Heroin took everything. That made it dangerous in ways beyond law enforcement. It made it destabilizing. Sal understood immediately why the elders hesitated. Drugs invited chaos. They destroyed neighborhoods. They created addicts who could not be controlled by loyalty or fear. They drew attention like blood and water. But Sal also understood why the conversation would not stop. The money was not just better. It was transformative. Heroin was not a street hustle. It was not a corner operation. It was a chain. A long, delicate chain stretching across continents. Each link had a hold. Each link had to remain invisible. This was not about muscle. This was about precision, logistics, chemistry, timing. It required the kind of discipline Sicily had perfected over centuries. Sal listened as older men dismissed it publicly while asking questions privately. How was it moved? How was it refined? How was it hidden? Who controlled the supply? These questions did not belong to men uninterested in the answers. They belonged to men weighing inevitability. The old rackets had a rhythm. Predictable collections. Predictable disputes. Predictable solutions. Law enforcement learned that rhythm too. They mapped it. They studied it. They built careers on understanding it. Heroin disrupted that rhythm entirely. It moved in silence. It moved in bulk. It moved where no one expected it. Sal saw the appeal clearly. Heroin did not require daily presence. It did not require visible enforcement. It could be handled by specialists, chemists, couriers, accountants. It allowed men like Sal to operate at distance, insulated from the damage while benefiting from the flow. But distance did not erase responsibility. Sal felt the weight of it anyway. He had grown up watching communities bound together by shared struggle. He understood what addiction would do to those same streets. This was not an abstract concern. It was personal. And yet, inevitability pressed harder than conscience. Others would do it if they did not. Less disciplined groups. Louder groups. Groups that would invite chaos and law enforcement alike. The question was no longer whether heroin would enter the ecosystem. It was who would control how it entered. Sal understood that control was not about dominance. It was about containment. If heroin had to exist, It had to move through channels that minimize collateral damage. That was the logic used to justify the shift. Not morality. Management. The first movements were cautious. Test runs. Small quantities. Routes tested for reliability. Sicily handled refinement. America handled distribution. Each side monitored the other without appearing to. Trust expanded only as far as necessity demanded. Sal found himself increasingly central to these discussions. Not because he advocated loudly, but because he asked the right questions. What happens if a shipment is delayed? What happens if someone panics? What happens if law enforcement stumbles on a part of the route by accident? These were not pessimistic questions. They were survival questions. Heroin required a new mindset. Speed was dangerous. Volume attracted attention. The goal was consistency. Predictable flow. Predictable money. Predictable silence. Sal worked to slow ambitions that threatened to outrun discipline. He also noticed how heroin changed the men around it. Greed sharpened. Paranoia intensified. Patience thinned. Some men wanted to rush expansion. Others wanted to pretend nothing had changed. Sal navigated between these extremes carefully. He understood that heroin could not be run like gambling. Gamblers lost money. Addicts lost themselves. That distinction mattered. It meant violence would increase if the operation lost discipline. Desperation bred unpredictability. Unpredictability bred mistakes. Sal pushed for structure. Clear lines. Limited access. Strict rules. Those who handle heroin would not handle other rackets. Compartmentalization reduced exposure. Reduced exposure increased longevity. This was not kindness. It was engineering. The money began to speak louder than words. Profits dwarfed the old rackets. Entire years of numbers collections matched in weeks. This altered the internal balance of power. Men who once mattered less now controlled massive flows of cash. That shift created resentment. Sal watched it carefully. He saw alliances strain. Old loyalties tested. Some men believed heroin should elevate them faster. Others believed it should be restricted. Sal understood that both positions carried danger. Elevation bred visibility. Restriction bred rebellion. He moved quietly to stabilize these tensions. Adjusting distribution. Rotating responsibilities. Ensuring no single person became indispensable. Indispensable people attracted attention. Replaceable people maintained stability. Law enforcement pressure increased, but unevenly. Police understood gambling. They understood unions. Heroin confused them at first. It did not fit existing frameworks. Jurisdiction blurred. Responsibility blurred. Sal exploited that confusion by maintaining distance. He rarely spoke about heroin directly. He referred to it indirectly, using neutral language. Movement. Product. Material. The fewer times the word was spoken, the safer everyone felt. Language mattered. It shaped mindset. Sal also understood the importance of denial. Publicly, families condemned drugs. Privately, they managed them. This duality was not hypocrisy. It was insulation. Public condemnation provided cover. Private control provided profit. He observed how other groups handled heroin poorly. Street-level dealing. Violence. Chaos. Arrests. These failures reinforced Sal's belief that discipline was the only path to survival. Heroin could not be democratized. It had to remain centralized. The route stabilized. Sicily to Europe. Europe to America. America to cities. Each step controlled by a different layer. No one saw the full picture. Sal saw enough to understand where the vulnerabilities lay. He adjusted communication methods. Fewer calls. More intermediaries. More face-to-face conversations conducted in motion. Movement reduced predictability. Predictability invited surveillance. Sal began to sense that heroin was reshaping the Mafia itself. Old values eroded under new pressures. Honor meant less when money moved faster. Loyalty became transactional. Sal resisted this shift where he could, but he was not naive enough to believe it could be stopped. He focused instead on shaping its impact, slowing decay, preserving structure, maintaining a hierarchy that valued restraint over impulse. This made him unpopular with some. He accepted that. Popularity was not a survival metric. There were moments when Sal questioned the path. Late nights, quiet rooms, thoughts that surfaced when distractions faded. He wondered whether the Alliance had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Whether containment was an illusion. Whether control was temporary. But doubt did not change reality. Reality moved forward regardless. Sal chose to move with it rather than be crushed beneath it. The streets began to feel the effects. Addiction crept into neighborhoods. Families unraveled. Sal did not witness this directly. Distance protected him from the worst images. But he knew, knowledge without proximity is still knowledge. He justified his role the only way men like him could, by believing that worse actors would do worse damage if left unchecked. That belief did not erase guilt. It compartmentalized it. Heroin demanded constant vigilance. One weak link could expose the entire chain. Sal monitored those links relentlessly, removing those who faltered, isolating those who drew attention. He did this without ceremony. Survival did not require explanation. The old rackets began to feel obsolete. Necessary, but secondary. Heroin had become the engine. The rest were support systems. This inversion changed priorities, changed alliances, changed risk calculations. Sal adapted faster than most. Adaptation had always been his strength. He did not cling to identity. He clung to function. What worked stayed. What failed disappeared. He watched as the scale increased quietly. More routes, more volume, more money. Each increase carried exponential risk. Sal slowed expansion where possible. Speed was intoxicating. He remained sober. The alliance between Sicily and America deepened further. Heroin bound them tighter than marriage ever could. Shared risk created shared fate. There would be no easy exit. Sal understood that clearly. He also understood that heroin left trails. Not physical ones at first, but human ones. Addicts talked. Desperation leaked information. Law enforcement would eventually connect dots. The question was how long the system could remain ahead. Sal prepared for that inevitability, building redundancy, planning contingencies, assuming exposure rather than denying it. Preparedness was the only defense against surprise. As heroin replaced the old rackets, the Mafia itself began to change shape. Less neighborhood-based, more corporate, less emotional, more logistical. Sal fit this new shape perfectly. Others struggled. He did not celebrate this. He endured it, because he knew that every transformation carries its own collapse within it. Heroin was powerful. It was profitable. It was also unsustainable at scale. Sal could feel the pressure building, invisible but relentless, like a fault line shifting beneath the surface. Nothing had cracked yet, but it would. And when it did, it would not shatter quietly. It would expose everything. Sal Gambino continued moving forward anyway, not because he believed the system was invincible, but because stopping was no longer an option. The old rackets had been left behind. The new era had arrived, and it would demand a price no one could yet calculate. Chapter 5. The Birth of the Pizza Connection. It began the way the most dangerous ideas always do, not as a plan, but as a solution. A quiet answer to a problem no one wanted to name out loud. Heroin had replaced the old rackets, but heroin brought a new kind of exposure. The product moved well. The money moved fast. What did not move easily was explanation. Too many eyes were learning where to look. Too many patterns were becoming familiar. Sal Gambino understood that if heroin was going to survive, it would need a disguise so ordinary it disappeared in plain sight. The solution was not invented in a single room. It emerged slowly, stitched together from habits people barely questioned. Food moved across borders every day. Always had. Containers passed through ports without drama. Inspectors were trained to look for spoilage, not secrets. And pizza, of all things, had become America's most trusted indulgence. Cheap, familiar, everywhere. No one feared it. No one suspected it. Sal did not smile when the idea surfaced. He did not react at all. That was how he evaluated ideas. Excitement clouded judgment. Fear sharpened it. He asked questions instead. How often did shipments arrive? Who owned the suppliers? How many hands touched a box between Sicily and Brooklyn? Which routes repeated themselves? Which ports were bored? The brilliance of the concept was not in deception. It was in normalcy. Pizza parlors were cash-heavy businesses. They explained income without scrutiny. They explained frequent deliveries. They explained international suppliers. They explained why men gathered late at night and spoke in half-sentences. They explained everything without explaining anything at all. Sal saw immediately that this was not about restaurants. It was about infrastructure. Pizza was the skin. Logistics were the bones. Heroin would move like blood beneath it, unseen as long as the body appeared healthy. The first experiments were cautious. A shipment hidden among legitimate supplies. A route tested for delay. A port observed for curiosity. Sal monitored every variable. Time mattered. Repetition mattered. Reaction mattered. Nothing could feel rushed. If anything felt unusual, it would draw attention. What reassured him most was how little attention it drew. Inspectors glanced. Dockworkers unloaded. Trucks rolled out. Nothing slowed. Nothing questioned. The system did not resist because it did not feel threatened. That was the true genius of it. Sal understood then that the pizza connection was not just clever. It was evolutionary. It adapted to the environment rather than fighting it. Old rackets forced confrontation. This avoided it entirely. Ownership structures were layered carefully. No single person appeared to control too much. Pizza shops changed names, changed managers, changed suppliers on paper while remaining constant in practice. Money flowed through registers like water through stone, leaving no visible trace. Sal oversaw coordination rather than execution. He did not need to touch the product. He did not need to see the shipments. His role was to ensure balance. Volume matched capacity. Profit matched discretion. Growth matched invisibility. The men who worked the system were selected for temperament, not loyalty alone. Loyalty could be tested. Temperament revealed itself under pressure. Sal chose men who did not panic when delays occurred. Men who did not celebrate success too loudly. Men who understood that boredom was the goal. Heroin was hidden not in obvious places, but in predictable ones. Beneath flour. Inside cans. Among ingredients that passed through kitchens daily. The metaphor was perfect. Poison hidden in nourishment. Sal did not romanticize this. He understood its cruelty. He also understood its efficiency. The routes expanded carefully. Sicily to Europe. Europe to the United States. Each leg insulated from the next. No courier knew the full path. No manager saw the entire chain. Sal ensured fragmentation. Fragmentation protected the whole. He watched how pizza parlors became something else entirely. Not just businesses, but nodes. Meeting points. Financial laundries. Quiet offices disguised by grease-stained menus and flickering lights. Men spoke freely there because they believed they were invisible. Sal ensured they were. Money was counted slowly, laundered patiently. There were no sudden purchases, no flamboyant displays. Wealth was allowed to accumulate quietly, like sediment. Sal discouraged excess. Excess attracted envy. Envy attracted betrayal. The pizza connection thrived because it felt boring, repetitive, predictable. That predictability lulled everyone into complacency. Everyone except Sal. He tracked patterns obsessively. Shipment frequency, delivery timing, cash flow irregularities. Anything that deviated from expectation triggered review. Sal trusted systems, not people. Systems failed less often. Law enforcement remained focused on old rackets. Gambling, labor, violence. Pizza did not fit their image of organized crime. Food felt harmless, domestic, even comforting. That bias worked in Sal's favor. The scale grew quietly. Dozens of shops, then more, spread across cities, across states. Each one indistinguishable from the next. Each one essential. Sal resisted calls to expand faster. He had learned that speed killed invisibility. He also resisted centralization. The temptation to consolidate power was strong. Centralization simplified control, but magnified risk. Sal preferred controlled chaos. It was harder to map, harder to dismantle. Men began to whisper about the brilliance of the operation. Sal discouraged that too. Brilliance invited admiration. Admiration invited attention. He reminded them that survival was the only metric that mattered. The heroin moved smoothly. Too smoothly. Sal sensed danger in that. Success created confidence. Confidence loosened discipline. He tightened procedures preemptively. Reduced contact. Increased compartmentalization. Slowed expansion again. Some resented this. They wanted more. Faster. Bigger. Sal listened without agreeing. He had seen what happened to men who mistook opportunity for entitlement. They became careless. Carelessness was contagious. The pizza connection did something else unexpected. It changed how the Mafia viewed itself. Less family. More enterprise. Less neighborhood-based. More global. Sal understood that this shift carried existential risk. Identity anchored loyalty. Abstraction weakened it. He tried to preserve elements of the old structure where possible. Ritual, hierarchy, codes of conduct. These were not sentimental. They were stabilizing forces. Without them, the system would eat itself. Still, the operation grew beyond what anyone had anticipated. Heroin flooded markets. Money poured back faster than it could be absorbed. Sal worked constantly to slow the feedback loop. Money was power. Power needed discipline. He became increasingly isolated. Fewer people understood the full scope. Fewer still were trusted to. Sal accepted this solitude. It was the cost of oversight. Oversight required distance. At night, he thought about fragility. Every system had a breaking point. The pizza connection relied on secrecy, repetition, and trust. Trust was the weakest element. Trust could be betrayed, not out of malice, but fear. He planned for that too. Redundant routes, alternative suppliers, contingency shutdowns. He rehearsed collapse scenarios mentally. If one node fell, how would the rest survive? If one man talked, how far would the damage spread? He assumed someone would talk eventually. Assumptions kept him alert. Optimism killed vigilance. The brilliance of the pizza connection was not that it hid heroin. It hid intention. It disguised criminality as commerce. It normalized movement. It buried danger beneath habit. Sal understood that habit was the strongest camouflage. People stopped questioning what they saw every day. Pizza boxes stacked on a dolly did not trigger alarms. They triggered hunger. He watched as the operation embedded itself into the fabric of American life. Pizza nights, family dinners, college parties. The same boxes that delivered comfort delivered ruin. Sal did not dwell on the irony. Dwelling served no function. The money supported everything else. Legal defense, influence, expansion. It insulated leadership from exposure. It allowed distance to be maintained. Sal ensured that insulation remained intact. He noticed law enforcement begin to sense something, though they could not articulate it. Whispers of a larger network. Disconnected seizures. Unrelated arrests that hinted at coordination. Sal adjusted immediately. Routes shifted. Timing altered. Shops closed and reopened under new names. The system flexed without breaking. That flexibility reassured Sal. It also warned him. Systems that grew this large always attracted scrutiny eventually. The pizza connection had reached a scale where invisibility required constant effort. Effort required discipline. Discipline required leadership. Sal did not seek recognition for this. Recognition would have been fatal. He remained behind the scenes, ensuring the machine ran quietly, relentlessly, without ego. He understood that the pizza connection was no longer just an operation. It was a precedent, a blueprint. Others would try to replicate it. Most would fail. They would move too fast, speak too loudly, forget that invisibility was the product. Sal did not forget. He stood one evening in a small, unremarkable shop, watching customers come and go. Families, couples, teenagers. No one noticed him. That was the point. He felt no pride, no triumph, only awareness. This system had altered the balance of power permanently. It had tied Sicily and America together more tightly than ever before. It had replaced old rackets with something far more efficient and far more dangerous. And it had done so without a single shot fired. But Sal knew something others did not yet grasp. Systems built on silence eventually attract listeners. Patterns eventually emerge. Normalcy eventually cracks under scrutiny. The pizza connection had been born perfectly disguised. But birth was only the beginning. Survival would require something even harder. Endurance. And endurance, Sal knew, always came at a cost still waiting to be paid. Chapter 6. Pizza Shops as Cover. The danger was never in the product itself. Sal Gambino understood that early. Heroin could be weighed, wrapped, hidden, moved. It obeyed rules. People did not. The real risk lived in human behavior, in habits repeated too often, in conversations held too long, in confidence mistaken for safety. The pizza shops were never meant to be glamorous. They were meant to be dull. Dull enough that no one looked twice. Dull enough that the mind slid past them without friction. A pizza shop was the perfect disguise because it asked nothing of you. It was there when you were hungry. It took your cash. It handed you a box. No questions. No paperwork. No memory. It fit into the city like a loose brick that had always been there. Sal saw this immediately. He also saw how fragile that illusion could be if it was mishandled. Each shop was chosen for its ordinariness. Fluorescent lights that hummed. Menus faded at the edges. Floors that never quite felt clean. Nothing that suggested ambition. Nothing that suggested success. A thriving pizza shop was suspicious. A barely surviving one was invisible. Sal preferred the latter. Ownership was layered like sediment. On paper, the shops belonged to cousins, in-laws, distant relatives, sometimes men who barely knew how to make a pie. That was intentional. Competence in food mattered less than competence in silence. The real management happened elsewhere, through conversations that never mentioned pizza at all. Deliveries arrived daily. Flour, tomatoes, cheese, boxes stacked without ceremony. Sal understood that repetition was camouflage. Customs officials remembered unusual shipments. They forgot routine. The more boring the delivery, the safer it was. Nothing about pizza felt urgent. Urgency drew scrutiny. The shops served another purpose beyond disguise. They created a reason for presence. Men could come and go at all hours without raising suspicion. Meetings looked like meals. Arguments looked like conversations over a slice. Decisions were made while grease soaked into cardboard. Sal insisted on this informality. Formality created memory. Memory created trails. Money flowed through registers like water through cracks. Cash-heavy businesses explained income without explanation. Taxes were paid just enough to avoid attention, never enough to invite curiosity. Books were kept sloppy on purpose. Too clean meant fake. Too messy meant careless. Sal demanded the middle. He trained managers not to excel. Excellence attracted competitors. It attracted reviews. It attracted attention. The goal was adequacy. Survive. Blend. Disappear. A shop that won awards was a liability. A shop that barely paid rent was perfect. The men working inside were selected carefully. Not tough guys. Not loud personalities. People who showed up on time, kept their mouths shut, and went home. People who did not dream beyond the counter. Ambition was dangerous. Contentment was safe. Sal knew that the shops would eventually attract curiosity from within the organization itself. Men wanted to know where the money came from. They wanted access. Sal restricted that knowledge tightly. Curiosity was natural. Indulgence was not. Those who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned elsewhere. The pizza shops created rhythm. Open at noon. Close late. Same routine, every day. Routine created predictability. Predictability lulled outsiders into complacency. Sal watched the rhythm constantly, adjusting hours, adjusting staff, ensuring nothing stood out. He noticed how law enforcement moved through neighborhoods, how patrol cars lingered near bars but ignored takeout joints, how inspectors focused on sanitation, not shipments. Sal complied, just enough to pass inspections without pride. Pride was another form of exposure. The shops were scattered deliberately. No clusters. No obvious patterns. Different neighborhoods. Different demographics. Different supply chains on paper. In reality, Everything connected back to the same invisible spine. Sal maintained that spine quietly. He discouraged loyalty rituals inside the shops. No whispered greetings. No signals. No coded language. The more ordinary the environment felt, the safer it was. Anyone walking in should feel bored, not curious. The pizza boxes themselves became symbols of safety. Once sealed, no one wanted to open them. Heat, grease, smell, all deterrents. Sal appreciated how physical discomfort protected secrecy. No one inspected what they did not want to touch. He watched for subtle shifts in behavior. A worker staying late too often. A manager asking about suppliers. A delivery driver changing routes unnecessarily. These were small things. Small things caused big problems. Sal addressed them early, quietly. Sometimes that meant closing a shop. No explanation. A sudden rent increase. A plumbing issue. A family emergency. The shop would shutter, then reappear months later under a different name, a different owner, the same smell. Continuity without permanence. Sal understood that permanence attracted attention. Temporary structures survive longer. He treated shops like skin cells. Replaceable. Disposable. Necessary. The shops also served as listening posts. Not for information gathered intentionally, but incidentally. Conversations overheard. Complaints voiced. Rumors drifting in. Pizza shops attracted everyone. Workers. Cops. Teenagers. Drunks. Sal believed in passive intelligence. People talked freely around food. He filtered that noise carefully. Most of it meant nothing. Some of it hinted at shifts. A new task force. A new prosecutor. A rumor about surveillance. Sal never reacted immediately. Immediate reaction exposed fear. He waited. Confirmed. Adjusted. The greatest threat was familiarity. Regular customers. Friendly banter. Names learned. Sal discouraged closeness. Employees were taught to be polite, not personal. The fewer relationships formed, the fewer questions followed. He also knew addiction would eventually circle back to the shops. Addicts loitered. Dealers tested boundaries. Sal shut that down ruthlessly. The shops were not distribution points. They were cover. Any overlap invited disaster. Anyone who violated that boundary disappeared from the system entirely. The pizza shops had to remain clean of visible crime. No fights. No dealing. No gambling. Clean spaces were safe spaces. Sal enforced this without explanation. Rules did not require justification. As the network expanded, Sal felt the strain increase. More shops meant more variables. More variables meant more risk. He resisted expansion when others pushed for it. Growth had to be invisible. Invisible growth was slow. He also understood that the shops created complacency inside the organization. Men began to believe the disguise was perfect. Sal did not share that belief. Perfection bred arrogance. Arrogance bred mistakes. He ran drills mentally. If a shop was raided, what would be found? If a worker was arrested, what did they know? If a shipment was intercepted, what patterns would emerge? He assumed failure. Planning for failure kept success alive. Sal rarely visited the shops himself. Presence created memory. Memory created recognition. He delegated observation. Trusted lieutenants rotated locations. No one lingered long enough to be noticed. He learned which neighborhoods tolerated anonymity best. Places where everyone minded their own business. Places where poverty and noise masked activity. He avoided places where curiosity thrived. The shops began to feel like part of the city's immune system. They absorbed attention, redirected it, dulled it. Sal took no pleasure in this metaphor. He understood the harm beneath the surface. He also understood that harm did not stop systems from functioning. The money laundering became more sophisticated over time. Cash folded into payroll. Payroll folded into suppliers. Suppliers folded into import costs. Everything explained everything else. Sal insisted on moderation. Sudden spikes triggered audits. Audits triggered questions. He noticed how employees adapted. Some grew comfortable. Too comfortable. Sal rotated staff regularly. Comfort bred carelessness. New faces disrupted routine, just enough to keep alertness alive. The pizza shops were never meant to last forever. Sal accepted that. He saw them as phases, tools, temporary skins. He was already thinking about what would come after, even as the system thrived. Law enforcement remained slow to connect the dots. They saw pizza shops as fronts occasionally, but never as a network. Sal exploited that blindness by ensuring no two shops looked alike. Different menus, different layouts, different stories. He learned that investigators preferred patterns. Remove patterns, remove focus. Chaos protected order. The shops also provided something else: plausible deniability. When questioned, owners spoke about food costs, competition, rent. They complained like any small business owner. Their frustration felt authentic. Sal ensured it was. He trained people to complain convincingly. Happiness was suspicious. Struggle was relatable. A struggling pizza shop looked honest. Sal found dark humor in this, but never expressed it. Humor distracted. Focus mattered. As months passed, the shops became fixtures. People relied on them. Late nights, cheap meals, comfort. That reliance created invisibility. No one wanted to imagine something dangerous hiding in something familiar. Sal knew that familiarity was the greatest camouflage of all. But familiarity also bred attachment. Communities defended their pizza shops. They protested closures. They asked questions. Sal had not anticipated that. He adjusted by closing quietly, gradually, without announcement. He began to sense something else shifting. Law enforcement attention was broadening. Investigators were learning to look past stereotypes, past guns and clubs and bookmaking. They were starting to follow money, not noise. Sal responded by slowing everything. Less volume, more patience. The shops remained, but the flow eased. Pressure dissipated. He understood that survival sometimes meant contraction. The pizza shops had done their job. They had normalized movement. They had hidden infrastructure. They had allowed a global operation to embed itself into daily life without resistance. Sal stood outside one late at night, watching steam fog the windows. Inside, a worker wiped counters mechanically. A customer waited bored. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. That was the point. He felt no pride, no satisfaction, only vigilance. Because disguises worked best until they didn't. And Sal Gambino knew that even the most perfect cover eventually attracted attention from someone patient enough to look beyond the surface. The pizza shops were invisible now, too invisible. And invisibility, he knew, was never permanent. Chapter 7. Heroin floods America. No one marked the moment when it tipped. There was no headline, no siren, no single shipment that changed everything. It happened the way floods always do, quietly at first, then all at once. A little more volume here, a little more demand there. Streets that had once absorbed the flow without reaction suddenly began to buckle. Sal Gambino felt it before he saw it. The system was working too well. Heroin had stopped being scarce. Scarcity had once imposed discipline. It forced caution. It limited reach. Now the supply moved with such reliability that it lost its gravity. Reliability bred confidence. Confidence bred expansion. Expansion bred exposure. Sal watched the cycle tighten like a noose, even as money poured in faster than anyone had imagined possible. America did not understand what was happening to it. Not yet. Addiction did not announce itself as an invasion. It arrived disguised as relief, a way to soften pain, a way to escape work, disappointment, memory. It spread unevenly, pooling in neighborhoods already stretched thin. Sal did not walk those streets. He did not need to. The numbers told the story. Demand curves rising, distribution accelerating, complaints multiplying. The old logic said distance protected leadership. Sal knew that was only partly true. Distance delayed consequences, but did not erase them. The further heroin spread, the harder it became to contain the damage. Addicts were not rational actors. They broke patterns. They attracted attention. They pulled law enforcement into places it had once ignored. Sal began to hear reports that unsettled him. Not seizures, not arrests. Those were expected. What troubled him were the stories of chaos, of dealers acting independently, of new players trying to carve out space, of violence erupting where there had once been order. These were symptoms of oversaturation. He had always believed heroin could be managed like a system. Now he saw the limits of that belief. Systems required predictability. Addiction created volatility. Volatility undermined everything. The streets changed faster than the leadership structures could adapt. Old rules lost relevance. Younger men entered the trade without understanding its fragility. They chased profit without patience. They spoke too freely. They fought too publicly. Sal watched this erosion with a tightening jaw. He tried to slow the flow, quietly, incrementally, reducing shipments, redirecting routes, pulling back from certain markets. Others resisted. Money had become addictive too. Men who had tasted its speed did not want restraint. They mistook Sal's caution for weakness. Sal did not argue. Arguments created sides. Sides created fractures. He adjusted instead, removed access from those who pushed too hard, reassigned responsibilities, created delays without explanation. He understood that leadership sometimes meant frustrating people for their own survival. The damage continued anyway. Heroin seeped into places it had never reached before. Suburbs, schools, families that had believed themselves insulated. This expansion drew attention from new quarters. Politicians, media, federal agencies. The noise grew louder. Sal sensed the shift in law enforcement posture. Less focus on individual dealers. More focus on networks, patterns, supply chains. Investigators began asking different questions. Not who sold, but how it arrived. Not who used, but who benefited. That worried him more than arrests ever had. The flood changed the internal culture too. Fear became sharper. Paranoia deepened. Men who had once trusted one another now suspected betrayal everywhere. Informants emerged, some real, some imagined. Sal watched as loyalty frayed under pressure. He reinforced discipline wherever he could. Meetings shortened. Communication tightened. Names stopped being spoken. But discipline could not undo damage already done. The flood had altered the landscape permanently. He thought often about responsibility, not in moral terms, in practical ones. Could the system survive the consequences of its own success? Could containment still be possible, or had the volume crossed a point of no return? He saw how addiction changed communities. Businesses shuttered. Families fractured. Violence spiked unpredictably. These effects did not remain isolated. They rippled outward, pulling attention with them. Sal felt those ripples as tremors through the network. The money continued to arrive. Too much of it. Sal slowed its distribution, fearing sudden wealth would attract scrutiny. He encouraged reinvestment into legitimate fronts. Real estate, businesses, anything that could absorb cash quietly. Still, the flow was relentless. He noticed another shift. Rival organizations began to imitate the model without understanding its discipline. They copied the appearance without the structure. Their failures drew attention that threatened everyone. Law enforcement did not differentiate carefully. One failure tainted the entire ecosystem. Sal grew more isolated. Fewer people shared his concerns. Many were drunk on success. He could not afford to be. His role demanded foresight. Foresight was lonely. The flood reached a point where denial became impossible. Overdoses climbed. Media coverage intensified. Politicians demanded action. Task forces formed. Resources shifted. Heroin was no longer an invisible problem. It was a public crisis. Sal understood what that meant. When a problem became public, it became political. Political problems demanded symbolic victories. Symbolic victories require targets. Targets would be chosen not for guilt, but for impact. He began planning for that inevitability. Mapping exposure. Assessing who knew what. Who could withstand pressure. Who would break. He assumed someone would. It was not pessimism. It was realism. The flood also changed the psychology of the users. Early addicts had been discreet. Later ones were desperate. Desperation created chaos. Chaos attracted violence. Violence attracted law enforcement. Sal saw the chain reaction clearly. He attempted to restore scarcity artificially, limiting supply to certain markets, pulling back abruptly. This caused backlash. Prices spiked. Violence increased. Scarcity did not restore order. It destabilized it further. Sal realized then that control had already been lost at the street level. The system could influence, but not dictate. That was a sobering recognition. He turned his focus upward, protecting the structure, preserving distance, ensuring leadership insulation. If the streets burned, the network had to survive the fire. The flood exposed another truth. Heroin had replaced the old rackets not just economically, but culturally. It had shifted values. Money mattered more than order. Speed mattered more than silence. Sal resisted this internally, but the tide was strong. He found himself thinking back to Sicily, to the patience, the slowness, the respect for limits. America did not respect limits. It expanded until forced to stop. Sal understood he was operating in a fundamentally different environment now. The alliances strained. Sicily grew uneasy with the visibility. America pushed for continued expansion. Sal mediated constantly, absorbing tension from both sides. He felt like a dam holding back pressure that would eventually break. The flood reached law enforcement in unexpected ways. Hospitals reported trends. Schools noticed patterns. Community leaders demanded answers. The response broadened beyond traditional policing. Federal agencies coordinated. International cooperation increased. Sal saw this coming and adjusted routes again. Shortened chains, reduced touch points. But coordination itself created patterns. Patterns could be studied. Studied patterns could be disrupted. He watched arrests climb. Some low-level, some mid-level. Each arrest sent shockwaves through the system. Some men talked. Most did not. But even silence could be informative. Investigators learned from absence as much as presence. Sal tightened isolation further. Fewer meetings. Less overlap. More delegation. He accepted that he would eventually lose visibility into certain areas. Visibility carried risk. Blind spots were safer. The flood also affected internal discipline. Some men succumbed to addiction themselves. That was unacceptable. Sal removed them immediately. Addiction destroyed reliability. Reliability was everything. He enforced this rule without exception. No sentiment. No second chances. This hardened his reputation. He did not care. Leadership required clarity. The money continued to distort priorities. Legal defense budgets ballooned. Bribes increased. Influence expanded. These were necessary expenses. They also created trails. Sal balanced these costs carefully, never letting any single channel dominate. He saw how the public narrative formed. Evil traffickers, innocent victims, simple villains, simple heroes. Sal understood the appeal of simplicity. He also understood its danger. Simple narratives demanded simple resolutions. Someone would have to pay. He began preparing psychologically for that outcome. He did not know when it would come. He only knew it would. The flood had made invisibility impossible indefinitely. Sal did not panic. Panic destroyed planning. He adjusted timelines, slowed operations, created buffers, ensured redundancies, prepared for contraction. The flood reshaped the Mafia's relationship with America. Once tolerated as a nuisance, it was now framed as a threat. That shift changed everything. Law enforcement resources multiplied. Legal tools expanded. International cooperation intensified. Sal watched these changes like a chess player watching the board fill with new pieces. He anticipated moves, counter-moves, sacrifices. He accepted that the flood could not be reversed, only survived. The streets paid the price first. Communities fractured. Violence escalated. Families mourned. Sal did not witness this directly. He did not need to. The system absorbed it. The numbers reflected it. He felt no triumph, no pride. Only responsibility. Responsibility, without control, was heavy. As the flood peaked, Sal sensed the water beginning to recede in certain areas. Not because the problem was solved, but because law enforcement pressure altered distribution. New routes, new methods, new risks. He adjusted again. Constant adjustment was the only constant. The flood had changed everything. It had drawn attention that could not be ignored. It had exposed vulnerabilities that could not be unseen. It had forced a reckoning. Sal stood at the center of it all, quiet, calculating, absorbing pressure from every direction. He knew the system had entered its most dangerous phase. Not growth, not expansion, exposure. And exposure, he understood, was when mistakes became fatal. The flood had arrived. The water was everywhere. And somewhere beyond the surface, eyes were beginning to look up. Chapter 8. The eyes begin to open. The first sign was not an arrest. It was curiosity, the kind that lingers after a meeting ends, when someone asks a question that does not fit the conversation. Sal Gambino noticed those questions before anyone else did, not because he heard them directly, but because he felt the system hesitate, a pause where there had never been one before, a delay that could not be explained by weather or traffic. Curiosity was friction, and friction meant heat. For years, law enforcement had chased noise. Street violence, gambling busts, labor disputes. They understood the old rackets because the old rackets wanted to be understood. They left marks. They left bodies. They left patterns that begged to be followed. The pizza connection did not behave like that. It moved like commerce, not crime. It blended into the everyday flow of life so thoroughly that it became part of the background. But backgrounds only stay invisible until someone learns how to focus. The eyes that began to open were not those of a single detective or agency. They belonged to a system under pressure to explain a crisis it had failed to anticipate. Heroin was everywhere now. Not concentrated, not isolated. Everywhere. Emergency rooms filled. Schools whispered. Neighborhoods changed overnight. The public demanded answers, and answers demanded villains. Sal understood that this was the most dangerous phase. Not when law enforcement knew too little, and not when it knew everything. The danger lived in the middle, when suspicion outpaced evidence, when investigators were free to imagine connections they could not yet prove. The first threads they pulled were not dramatic. A seizure here, an arrest there, different cities, different players. But the product was similar, the packaging familiar, the purity consistent. Patterns emerged slowly, like a picture developing in chemical baths. Sal had always assumed this moment would come. What surprised him was how quietly it arrived. There were no raids splashed across newspapers, no speeches, just questions being asked more often, by more people, in more places. He felt it in Sicily first. A delay at a port that could not be explained. A shipment rerouted without warning. An inspector who lingered longer than necessary. None of these things were alarming on their own. Together, they formed a signal. In America, the shift was subtler. Pizza shops experienced inspections that went beyond sanitation. Questions about suppliers. Questions about finances. Questions framed casually, but repeated often enough to suggest preparation. Sal noticed which questions were asked and which were not. That mattered. Investigators were beginning to think structurally. Not who sold drugs, but how drugs moved. Not who profited, but how profits were hidden. That change in perspective worried Sal more than any arrest ever had. He responded by tightening the system further. Less communication, fewer meetings, more distance between nodes. He accepted inefficiency as the price of survival. Efficiency had brought them here. Inefficiency might save them. Sal also understood the psychology of investigation. Investigators needed narratives. They needed beginnings, middles, ends. The pizza connection resisted narrative. It had no obvious start, no clear hierarchy, no single villain. Sal intended to keep it that way. But narratives have a way of forming anyway. The first coordinated inquiries emerged across jurisdictions. This mattered. Local law enforcement had always been limited by borders. Borders slowed everything. Now those borders were thinning. Information traveled faster. Patterns shared across cities revealed connections that single departments could not see. Sal adjusted routes again, changed suppliers, closed shops preemptively. He treated the system like a living organism shedding skin. Painful, necessary. He also began distancing himself further from day-to-day operations. Knowledge was liability. He compartmentalized his own awareness, ensuring that even he did not hold more information than absolutely necessary. This was not humility. It was insulation. The men around him sensed the tension. Conversations shortened. Smiles faded. Jokes stopped landing. Fear began to circulate, subtle but persistent. Sal managed it carefully. Panic was the real enemy. Panic created mistakes. He spoke less. When he spoke, it was precise. Calm. He projected stability, even as he felt uncertainty deepen. Leadership, he knew, was often a performance meant to reassure others while carrying private doubt. The eyes opening were not limited to law enforcement. Journalists began asking questions too. Not accusatory. Curious. Why were overdoses spiking in places with no obvious supply lines? Why did certain businesses appear consistently near clusters of addiction? These questions were not yet dangerous, but they hinted at attention drifting in the wrong direction. Sal monitored media as carefully as shipments. Stories mattered. Public narratives influenced political pressure. Political pressure influenced law enforcement priorities. He preferred the story remain about street dealers and foreign suppliers. Anything else was dangerous. He noticed politicians shifting language, talking less about morality and more about networks, about international cooperation, about following money rather than arresting bodies. Sal understood that this language signaled resources being redirected. The system responded with its own adaptations. Money laundering methods changed. New fronts emerged. Old ones closed. Sal avoided patterns that could be charted over time. Consistency was no longer safe. He began to feel the weight of inevitability pressing closer. Not doom, not collapse, but confrontation. The eyes were opening. The system could no longer rely on invisibility alone. Sal asked himself difficult questions during long, quiet nights. Not about guilt, about feasibility. Could the operation continue under sustained scrutiny? Could adaptation outpace attention? Could silence still protect when curiosity spread across continents? He did not romanticize the answers. He saw limits clearly. Every system had them. The Pizza Connection had thrived because it exploited blind spots. Blind spots shrink once identified. The investigators were not brilliant. Sal knew that too. They were persistent. Persistence was more dangerous. Brilliant people burned out. Persistent ones wore systems down. The first significant breach did not come from leadership. It never did. It came from the edges. A low-level arrest. A frightened man. A choice between prison and cooperation. Sal had always planned for this. He had just hoped to delay it longer. He did not react immediately. Immediate reaction betrayed awareness. He waited, observed, measured response. Which names surfaced? Which routes were questioned? Which locations drew attention? From this, he inferred what law enforcement knew and what it did not. The picture forming was incomplete. That offered opportunity. Sal orchestrated controlled sacrifices. Nodes he could afford to lose. People whose knowledge was limited. These losses were painful, but necessary. Better to lose a finger than a hand. Better to feed investigators partial truths than allow them to stumble onto the core. He accepted that some men would go to prison. That was always part of the cost. He ensured their families were cared for. Not out of sentiment, but obligation. Neglect bred resentment. Resentment bred cooperation. The eyes opening also created tension with Sicily. The island had always relied on distance for protection. Now distance felt less reliable. International cooperation threatened that insulation. Sal mediated constantly, reassuring both sides while adjusting strategy. He reduced transatlantic movement, shortened chains, increased local autonomy. Autonomy reduced exposure, but weakened control. Sal accepted that trade-off. Control was less important than survival. He also noticed a shift in the tone of inquiries. Less curiosity, more confidence. Investigators were beginning to believe they understood something real. Belief emboldened them. Emboldenment accelerated action. Sal watched as task forces formed. Names changed. Units merged. Resources pooled. This mattered more than individual arrests. It signaled institutional commitment. The Pizza Connection was no longer invisible. It was suspected. Suspicion changed everything. He reviewed contingency plans constantly. If a shop was raided, what would be found? If a supplier was compromised, how quickly could routes shift? If communications were intercepted, how much damage would spread. He discovered that his greatest vulnerability was time. Investigations moved slowly, but relentlessly. They accumulated knowledge, the way the operation accumulated money. Gradually, irreversibly. Sal could slow them. He could not stop them entirely. He began preparing psychologically for outcomes he had long avoided naming. Indictments, extradition, trials. Not because he believed they were imminent, but because unpreparedness would be fatal. He maintained his calm publicly. Privately, he refined his detachment. Emotional distance was necessary. Fear clouded judgment. Regret distracted. The eyes opening also affected internal trust. Paranoia increased. Men watched one another more closely. Old friendships cooled. Sal discouraged accusations. Accusations fractured unity. Unity mattered more than certainty. He understood that informants would exist whether acknowledged or not. He built systems resilient enough to withstand leaks. Compartmentalization became stricter. Information flowed downward, never upward. The public narrative intensified. Heroin was now a crisis, not a problem. Crisis demanded solutions. Solutions demanded targets. Sal knew the operation was becoming a target, even if its name remained unknown. He watched politicians compete to appear tough. He watched budgets swell. He watched rhetoric harden. These are not abstract developments. They translated into agents, wiretaps, surveillance. Sal adjusted communication methods again. More face-to-face. Less technology. Movement replaced stillness. Predictability vanished. He also began withdrawing from visibility entirely. He limited his own appearances, reduced his footprint. The less he existed on paper, the better. The eyes opening forced him to confront something uncomfortable. The system he had built was no longer just hiding from law enforcement. It was shaping law enforcement behavior. That feedback loop was dangerous. It meant attention would continue to increase until resolution was forced. Sal did not believe in endings. He believed in transitions. He began thinking about how to transition the operation into something smaller, quieter, less ambitious. But ambition had already taken root elsewhere. He could not control everyone. He accepted that his role might soon shift from architect to stabilizer, from builder to absorber of shock. The eyes opening also revealed something else. The operation had become too successful to disappear quietly. Too many people depended on it. Too much money flowed through it. Collapse would be loud. Sal weighed the cost of contraction against the cost of exposure. Neither option was safe. He chose the one that preserved time. Time allowed adjustment. Adjustment allowed survival. He slowed everything. Profits dipped. Complaints rose. He ignored them. Survival mattered more than satisfaction. The investigators were patient too. They mapped. They correlated. They waited for mistakes. Sal knew that mistakes were inevitable. Humans made them under pressure. He tried to reduce human error. Automation where possible. Simplicity everywhere. But complexity had already crept in. Complexity resisted simplification. The eyes opening marked the end of innocence. Not moral innocence. Operational innocence. The belief that invisibility alone could protect them. Sal accepted that belief had expired. He stood one night looking out over a city that no longer felt anonymous. Lights stretched endlessly. Somewhere within them, people were asking questions that had never been asked before. He felt no panic, no urgency, only focus. The eyes had opened. Now the real test would begin. Chapter 9. Law enforcement connects the dots. The first dots were meaningless on their own. A traffic stop in one city. A routine search in another. A nervous man caught with something he should not have had. Each incident filed away, labeled forgotten. Sal Gambino understood that danger never announced itself as danger. It accumulated, quietly, patiently, one detail at a time. For years, law enforcement had chased fragments. Street dealers, local distributors, addicts willing to trade names for leniency. Those cases filled cells but explained nothing. What began to change was not the arrests, but the conversations between agencies after them. Someone noticed similarities that should not have existed. Packaging that looked too familiar. Purity levels too consistent. routes that curved in ways that defied coincidence. Sal felt the shift before anyone said aloud. Information began to move laterally instead of vertically. Local reports reached federal desks. Federal analysts began asking questions that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with structure. They were no longer interested in who pulled the trigger. They wanted to know who moved the boxes. This was the moment Sal had anticipated for years. The moment when curiosity hardened into focus. Investigators began pulling case files from different cities and laying them side by side. What had once looked random now revealed rhythm. Shipments arrived on similar schedules. Money flowed through similar types of businesses. Names repeated across jurisdictions, not prominently, but persistently. Repetition was impossible to ignore once noticed. Sal understood that law enforcement, like any system, needed momentum. One connection led to another. One success justified more resources. Once that momentum began, it rarely slowed on its own. He adjusted immediately, though quietly. Routes were shortened. Volumes reduced. Certain nodes went dark without explanation. He accepted losses as the cost of concealment. Better to lose money than visibility. But law enforcement had crossed a threshold. They were no longer reacting. They were theorizing. Analysts began mapping supply chains backward from overdose clusters. Instead of following money outward, they followed harm inward. That change in approach bypassed many traditional defenses. Sal had prepared for financial scrutiny. He had not fully anticipated moral scrutiny becoming investigative strategy. Hospitals shared data. Schools reported patterns. Public health agencies entered the conversation. What had once been a criminal issue became a societal one. That expanded the circle of attention dramatically. Sal saw how this altered the narrative. The story was no longer about criminals fighting criminals. It was about communities under siege. That framing demanded a different response. Politicians leaned in. Budgets expanded. International cooperation intensified. Dots began connecting across borders. European seizures mirrored American ones. Shipping manifests overlapped. Import companies appeared repeatedly, always one step removed from wrongdoing, always legally plausible. Investigators noticed that plausibility itself had become a pattern. Sal felt the pressure tighten. The space for error narrowed. Law enforcement no longer needed proof to continue. They needed suspicion. Suspicion justified surveillance. Surveillance produced more dots. He responded by creating noise elsewhere. Smaller operations allowed to fail. Distractions introduced deliberately. Let investigators chase false complexity while the core remained insulated. This tactic bought time, but time was becoming expensive. The first serious multi-agency meetings occurred without fanfare. No announcements. No press. Just rooms full of people comparing notes. Sal knew this because he felt the ripple effects. Questions asked in Sicily echoed in New York days later. Information was no longer siloed. The pizza connection, though not yet named publicly, had begun to exist in the minds of investigators as a hypothesis. Hypotheses were dangerous. They shaped how evidence was interpreted. Everything became confirmation once the theory took hold. Sal understood that once law enforcement believed a network existed, they would find one, even if imperfectly. The question was whether they would find the right one. He tightened compartmentalization further, reduced cross-communication to the bare minimum. He ensured that no single arrest could illuminate the entire structure. This had always been his philosophy. Now it was his lifeline. But people broke under pressure. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Subtly. A detail shared. A hesitation noticed. A timeline clarified. Each cooperation added another. Sal tracked these developments indirectly. He paid attention to which questions were being asked of people he knew. Questions revealed knowledge. Knowledge revealed focus. He adjusted accordingly. He noticed law enforcement becoming more patient. They stopped making flashy arrests. They waited. Waiting was dangerous. It meant they were building something larger. Financial analysts joined the effort. They traced money not to enrichment, but to circulation. Pizza shops that barely broke even. Import companies with odd margins. Cash flows that made sense only if viewed as part of a larger system. Sal had designed the system to appear boring. Now that boredom itself became suspicious. He felt the weight of inevitability grow heavier. Not panic, not despair, a kind of clarity. The system had reached a scale where concealment required constant effort from too many people. Too many people made mistakes. He began preparing for confrontation without naming it as such. Legal defenses were strengthened quietly. Relationships reinforced. Funds allocated for contingencies. He avoided conversations about escape. Escape was theatrical. He preferred endurance. The dots connected further when investigators began sharing intelligence internationally. Sicily was no longer distant. Extradition treaties mattered. Shared databases mattered. The sea no longer protected anyone. Sal sensed unease from the Sicilian side. Distance had always been their shield. Now that shield felt thin. He reassured them publicly while adjusting privately. Reduced transatlantic dependence. Increased local autonomy. The operation began a fracture by design. Fractures created insulation, but fractures also weakened cohesion. Sal balanced carefully, knowing too much cohesion invited exposure, too little invited collapse. The first major indictments were still far away, but Sal felt them approaching like weather. Pressure changed. Air thickened. Movement slowed. Law enforcement began connecting dots not just operationally, but historically. Old names resurfaced. Old cases re-examined. Patterns that spanned decades emerged. Sal realized then that the investigation was no longer just about heroin. It was about lineage, about continuity. That worried him more than any shipment seizure. The pizza connection had succeeded because it treated crime like logistics. Law enforcement was now treating it like history. History gave context. Context revealed intent. Sal reviewed old decisions in his mind. Choices made years earlier that now appeared differently under new scrutiny. He accepted that perfection was impossible. He focused instead on minimizing damage. He noticed another change. Investigators stopped asking how much money was made. They began asking who benefited from stability, who remained untouched while others fell. That question pointed upward. Sal maintained his distance. He did not appear in places where he could be remembered. He avoided creating memory. Memory was evidence waiting to happen. Still, dots continued to connect. A courier's testimony matched shipping records. A seized ledger matched bank activity. A phone call matched a delivery date. Each connection strengthened the case, even if no single piece proved it alone. Sal understood the danger of accumulation. Evidence did not need to be overwhelming. It needed to be coherent. He watched as prosecutors grew confident. Confidence changed strategy. They aimed higher. They planned broader. They delayed arrest to maximize impact. Sal slowed operations further. Money flowed more cautiously. He accepted losses. Survival mattered more than profit now. The internal tension grew. Men grew nervous. Some talked about leaving. Some talked about fighting. Sal discouraged both. Leaving created trails. Fighting created attention. He emphasized patience. Patience had always been his strength. He reminded others that investigations took time. That not knowing did not mean losing. But privately, he knew the dots had connected enough to make retreat difficult. The system had become too visible to disappear quietly. Law enforcement now had a map. Incomplete, imperfect, but a map nonetheless. They filled gaps with inference. Inference guided action. Sal prepared for the next phase without acknowledging it openly. He reviewed what could be sacrificed and what could not. He accepted that sacrifices would be required. The pizza connection, once invisible, now existed as an idea powerful enough to shape investigations. Ideas were harder to kill than operations. Sal felt the weight of history pressing closer. Not judgment, consequence. The dots were no longer scattered. They were forming a picture. And once a picture became clear enough to recognize, it could not be unseen. Sal remained still as the image sharpened, knowing that the next moves would define everything that followed. Because when law enforcement connects the dots, silence alone is no longer protection. It becomes a test. Chapter 10. The trap tightens. The moment the trap begins to close, it does not feel like danger. It feels like inconvenience. Sal Gambino noticed it first in the small things. Meetings that took longer to arrange. Messages that arrived later than expected. Men who once moved freely now hesitating before speaking. The system had not stopped working. It had started resisting itself. Law enforcement pressure did not announce itself with force. It arrived as weight, a constant, invisible pressure that made every movement heavier. Sal felt it in the way routes narrowed, in the way options quietly disappeared. Doors that had always been open were still unlocked, but something about them felt watched. Investigators no longer chased rumors. They chased continuity. They looked for what survived arrests, what remained untouched after seizures, what names never appeared, even when everything else did. Sal understood the danger of being absent too often. Absence itself became a presence. The pizza connection had once thrived on invisibility. Now invisibility looked deliberate. Investigators learned to ask why certain people never surfaced, why certain businesses never failed, why certain routes always recovered quickly after disruption. These questions did not require proof to justify attention. Sal responded by inserting noise where silence had once ruled, allowing controlled disruptions, letting some businesses fail publicly, permitting small chaos to mask the larger order. He understood that perfection attracted suspicion. Flaws felt authentic. The trap tightened through coordination. Agencies that once guarded information now shared it freely. Borders blurred. Jurisdictions overlapped. Sal sensed this most clearly in Sicily, where distance had always offered protection. Now distance felt symbolic, not functional. Ports that once felt predictable grew tense. Inspections became less casual. Delays increased without explanation. Sal recognized the strategy. Frustrate movement. Force mistakes. Pressure the system until someone broke. He adjusted again. Smaller shipments. Less frequent movement. More patience. Patience had always been his shield. But patience slowed profit, and slowing profit tested loyalty. Men complained quietly at first, then less quietly. They questioned whether the risk still matched the reward. Sal listened without responding. Debate created fractures. Fractures widened under pressure. He understood that law enforcement was betting on time. Investigations did not need speed. They needed endurance. The longer the pressure lasted, the more likely someone would make a mistake. Sal had built a system to withstand shock, not erosion. Erosion was harder to fight. The trap also tightened psychologically. Paranoia spread. Men questioned one another's silence. Innocent behavior felt suspicious. Suspicious behavior felt damning. Sal worked constantly to keep fear from turning inward. He discouraged speculation. Speculation bred panic. Panic created mistakes. He spoke calmly, infrequently, always projecting control. Leadership, at this stage, was emotional management. The first real sense of enclosure came when routes closed simultaneously in different regions. Not seized, not exposed, simply unavailable. Sal recognized the pattern immediately. Law enforcement was mapping dependencies, removing options to observe reactions. He responded by doing nothing. Reaction would reveal knowledge. Stillness preserved ambiguity. The stillness was uncomfortable. Men were used to motion. Motion created reassurance. Stillness felt like suffocation. Sal endured it without complaint. Investigators pressed harder. Surveillance expanded. Wiretaps increased. Financial audits multiplied. None of this was visible publicly. It was felt through resistance, through friction, through the subtle sense that everything took more effort than it should. Sal understood that the trap was designed to force consolidation. Under pressure, organizations centralized control to regain efficiency. Centralization created targets. Sal resisted this instinct. He allowed inefficiency to persist. Inefficiency scattered risk. The trap tightened legally as well. Prosecutors began assembling cases not for individual crimes, but for conspiracy. Conspiracy required narrative. Narrative required context. Context required time. Sal knew that conspiracy cases were built slowly, like walls brick by brick. Each brick insignificant alone. Together, inescapable. He began preparing for legal warfare rather than operational survival alone. Lawyers consulted quietly. Strategies refined. Silence enforced. He did not view this as surrender. He viewed it as another front. The men around him felt the change. The tone shifted. Conversations lost their edge. Humor disappeared. Every interaction felt like it might be remembered later in a courtroom. Sal encouraged restraint. Words were dangerous now. The trap tightened internationally. Extradition discussions surfaced. Mutual legal assistance treaties activated. Sicily was no longer insulated. Sal felt the anxiety ripple across the sea. He reassured partners without lying. He told them pressure was increasing. He told them adaptation was ongoing. He did not promise safety. Promises created expectations. Expectations created disappointment. The system continued operating, but cautiously. Profits dropped. Visibility dropped. That trade-off was intentional. Survival demanded sacrifice. Sal noticed investigators shifting strategy again. Less reliance on physical surveillance. More reliance on financial anomalies. Algorithms. Databases. Patterns invisible to the naked eye. This worried him. Human intuition could be misled. Data was relentless. He responded by muddying data deliberately, introducing inconsistencies, minor inefficiencies, transactions that broke patterns without drawing attention. Noise within the signal. The trap tightened socially. Informants emerged. Some real, some imagined. Sal treated all rumors seriously and none emotionally. He removed vulnerabilities systematically. Not with violence, but with distance. Men suspected of weakness were isolated, not accused. Accusation provoked defense. Isolation allowed observation. If they broke alone. The pressure exposed character. Some men grew smaller. Some grew reckless. Sal observed both with the same detachment. Recklessness was more dangerous than fear. He reinforced old rules. Silence. Patience. Loyalty without sentimentality. These rules felt archaic to some. Some did not argue. He enforced. The trap tightened through time. Investigations did not fade. They intensified. Years passed, not weeks. Sal felt the cumulative weight. Systems designed for growth struggled under sustained contraction. He began thinking less about expansion and more about legacy. Not reputation. Survival of structure. What could endure beyond individual failures? The pizza connection had once been an innovation. Now was a liability. Its very success had made it visible. Sal contemplated dismantling parts of it permanently. Not temporarily. Permanently. He did not rush this decision. Rushing would reveal fear. He waited for the right moment, watching how law enforcement positioned itself. He saw the outlines of impending indictments. Not yet filed, but drafted. Names circled. Timelines constructed. Evidence aligned. The trap was nearly set. Sal prepared for loss. Loss of people. Loss of money. Loss of anonymity. He did not prepare for defeat. Defeat was a conclusion. He dealt in transitions. The pressure reached a point where even silence felt loud. Absence felt deliberate. Stillness felt suspicious. Sal recognized this paradox. Invisibility was now interpreted as intent. He adjusted by becoming slightly visible. Carefully. Appearances that explained themselves. Movements that looked mundane. He allowed himself to exist just enough to avoid myth. The trap tightened anyway. Law enforcement confidence grew. Confidence led to boldness. Boldness led to mistakes. Sal waited for those mistakes. He knew they would come. But mistakes cut both ways. The first public signs of the investigation began to surface. Small articles. Anonymous sources. Whispers of a vast network. The pizza connection began to be spoken aloud, cautiously, experimentally. Sal felt the shift immediately. Once named, something could be targeted. Names gave shape to suspicion. He understood that the operation had entered its most dangerous phase. Not growth. Not exposure. Confrontation. The trap was almost closed. Sal stood in the middle of it, still deliberate, absorbing pressure from every direction. He knew that the next moves would not be his alone. Law enforcement, prosecutors, politicians, all would act. He could only control his response. And response, he knew, would define whether the trap crushed the system entirely or merely forced it to shed another layer of skin. The walls were close now, the air thinner. The trap had tightened. An escape, if it existed at all, would require something more than silence. Chapter 11. The first indictments fall. The first indictments did not arrive like thunder. They arrived like a change in air pressure, subtle enough that only those who had been watching closely felt it immediately. Sal Gambino sensed it before the names appeared on paper, before headlines formed sentences around words like conspiracy and trafficking. He felt it in the sudden stillness that followed certain conversations, in the way men avoided eye contact without knowing why, in the way silence itself seemed to listen. For years, the system had absorbed pressure without breaking. Arrests came and went. Seizures disrupted, but did not destroy. The structure flexed, adjusted, survived. Indictments were different. Indictments were not reactions. They were conclusions. They meant law enforcement believed it understood enough to commit publicly to a story. Sal had always known this moment would arrive. What unsettled him was not the fact of it, but the timing. The system was still functioning, still profitable, still disciplined. That meant the indictments were not about collapse. They were about leverage. The first names were not his. That was intentional. Prosecutors rarely began at the top. They began where pressure could travel upward. Mid-level operators, coordinators, men with enough knowledge to be useful, but not enough power to resist alone. These were not random choices. They were carefully selected stress points. Sal watched the reaction carefully. Panic revealed weakness. Defiance invited retaliation. The correct response was restraint. He instructed nothing explicitly. Instructions left trails. Instead, he modeled behavior. Calm, distance, continuity. The arrests rippled outward faster than the news. Phones rang and stopped ringing. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. Some men vanished from sight, not because they were guilty, but because fear made them visible. Sal noted each disappearance without comment. The indictments framed the operation in ways Sal had hoped to avoid. They spoke of networks, of international coordination, of fronts disguised as legitimate businesses. They did not yet have everything right, but they were close enough to be dangerous. Precision was no longer required. Narrative momentum was. Prosecutors painted a picture that connected dots Sal had worked years to keep separate. Some connections were overstated, some understated. Accuracy was secondary. Coherence was what mattered. Jurors needed stories, not spreadsheets. Sal understood this better than most. He had built systems around human psychology. Now that psychology was being used against him. The first court appearances were quiet, procedural, but heavy with implication. Men who had once felt insulated now sat under fluorescent lights, their lives reduced to docket numbers. Some looked defiant. Others looked lost. Sal did not attend. Presence created memory. Memory created association. He focused instead on containment, ensuring families were supported, legal defenses funded, silence maintained. These were not acts of kindness. They were investments. Neglect bred resentment. Resentment fed cooperation. He knew that cooperation was the real danger now. Not evidence already gathered, but evidence yet to be given. Indictments created fear. Fear created choices. Choices created outcomes Sal could no longer fully control. The prosecutors understood this dynamic well. They structured charges to maximize pressure. Mandatory minimums. Stacked counts. Threats of decades behind bars. These were not meant to be proven immediately. They were meant to be negotiated. Sal recognized the strategy. Break the middle. Work upward. Use time as a weapon. He adjusted accordingly. Communication tightened further. Information flow narrowed to the barest channels. Men spoke only when necessary. Meetings became rare, brief, inconclusive by design. He accepted inefficiency. Inefficiency protected against surveillance. The indictments also changed internal dynamics. Trust eroded. Men began reassessing loyalties not based on history, but on perceived risk. Sal watched these shifts with clinical detachment. Emotional responses would only cloud judgment. He understood that some men would talk no matter what he did. The goal was not to prevent all cooperation. That was impossible. The goal was to limit its usefulness. Compartmentalization became absolute. Knowledge that had once been shared among small groups was now isolated within individuals. If one man broke, he would break alone. Sal also recognized that prosecutors would attempt to provoke reactions. Raids timed for visibility. Press conferences designed to rattle. Leaks meant to sow doubt. He instructed nothing. Reaction would only confirm their significance. The media seized on the story eagerly. Words like pizza and heroin made irresistible headlines. The contrast was too perfect. Comfort and destruction. Ordinary and evil. Sal understood the danger of symbolism. Symbols bypassed nuance. The pizza connection was no longer just an investigation. It was a story. Stories had momentum of their own. Sal monitored coverage carefully, not for facts, but for framing. Which names were emphasized? Which roles described? Which connections inferred? From this, he could see where prosecutors were aiming. He noticed something that troubled him deeply. The story was beginning to personalize. Faces attached to concepts. Villains emerging from abstractions. Personalization simplified prosecution. It gave juries someone to focus on. Sal avoided personalization relentlessly. He maintained his distance. He ensured his name remained absent wherever possible. Absence was still protection, though thinner now. The indictments also emboldened law enforcement. Confidence surged. Confidence led to broader warrants, more aggressive surveillance, deeper financial probes. Sal felt the net widening. He responded by shrinking his footprint further. Assets shifted. Accounts closed. Businesses sold quietly. Everything slowed. Contraction was painful, but exposure was fatal. Men pushed back. They feared loss more than risk. Sal ignored their frustration. Leadership was not consensus. It was responsibility. The first cooperation rumors surfaced quickly. Names whispered. Stories half-formed. Sal did not react publicly. Privately, he assessed credibility. Some rumors were planted intentionally. Some were fear-driven. He waited for confirmation. He understood that not all cooperation was equal. Some men offered information that sounded valuable but led nowhere. Others held pieces that could illuminate entire sections of the network. Identifying which was which mattered. Sal insulated critical areas immediately. Routes altered. Contacts severed. He assumed compromise and acted accordingly. It was better to overreact than underestimate. The legal pressure altered time itself. What had once been measured in months was now measured in court dates. Deadlines imposed by judges replaced rhythms imposed by logistics. Sal adapted mentally. The battlefield had shifted. He also noticed how prosecutors framed Sal himself, even without naming him. References to unnamed organizers, coordinators, figures who maintained distance. These descriptions were meant to provoke reaction. Sal did not give them one. The indictments created fear, but they also created clarity. The system was no longer operating under ambiguity. It was under assault. That clarity allowed for decisive action. Sal began dismantling pieces of the operation permanently. Not pausing. Ending. Shops closed for good. Routes abandoned. Relationships allowed to fade. This was not retreat. It was triage. He understood that survival now meant reducing the scope of what could be proven, not preserving what once existed. The operation had to shrink to fit the shadows available. The men who remained closest to him noticed the change. Sal did not explain. Explanation created record. They adjusted or they did not. Those who could not adapt were quietly sidelined. The indictments also strained transatlantic relationships. Sicily feared exposure. America feared collapse. Sal balanced these fears carefully, speaking less and listening more. He knew that panic abroad could destabilize containment at home. He felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever, not just for himself, but for the structure he had helped build. Structures did not feel pain. People did. Sal absorbed that pain silently. The first trial dates loomed on the horizon. Not imminent, but inevitable. Sal began thinking in years rather than weeks. Long games required endurance. He reinforced legal strategy. Separate defenses. No shared narratives. Fragmentation in court mirrored fragmentation in operations. Unity looked powerful, but power attracted focus. Disunity confused. The prosecutors anticipated this. They saw conspiracy charges precisely to overcome fragmentation. Sal understood the irony. He had built a decentralized system to survive, and that very decentralization was now being used as proof of coordination. He adjusted again, allowed small inconsistencies to surface. Let parts of a narrative contradict each other. Inconsistency weakened conspiracy claims. It created reasonable doubt. The indictments marked the end of the operation's invisible phase. It now existed in the open, albeit distorted. Sal accepted this transition without illusion. He found himself thinking less about money and more about time. How much time remained before exposure reached irreversibility? How much time was needed to dismantle safely? How much time others could endure pressure without breaking? He did not romanticize the moment. There was no defiance, no anger, only focus. The first indictments had fallen. They had not destroyed the system yet, but they had changed its rules permanently. Sal stood at the center of that change, quieter than ever, aware that the next phase would not be about avoiding attention. It would be about surviving it. And survival, he knew, would demand sacrifices still unseen from people who had not yet realized their names were already written somewhere, waiting to be spoken aloud. Chapter 12, Betrayal Under Pressure. Betrayal never begins with a decision. It begins with exhaustion. Sal Gambino understood that long before the first man ever walked into a federal office and closed the door behind him. Pressure did not break people all at once. It wore them down, grain by grain, until silence felt heavier than speech and loyalty felt like a luxury no one could afford. The indictments had changed the atmosphere completely. Fear no longer drifted quietly through the system. It sat openly at the table. Men slept less. Tempers shortened. Conversations circled the same unspoken questions without ever touching them directly. Who would hold? Who would fold? Who had already done so? Sal felt a shift in tone before he saw its effects. People began asking questions framed as hypotheticals. What would happen if someone talked? How much did prosecutors really know? Whether silence still mattered once charges were filed. These were not idle thoughts. They were early fractures. Pressure restructured loyalty. In the past, loyalty had been inherited, reinforced by tradition and obligation. Now it was weighed against years in prison, against families left behind, against futures reduced to concrete walls. Sal did not condemn this calculus. He understood it. Understanding did not mean forgiving. The first defection was not dramatic. No headlines. No spectacle. Just a man who stopped resisting questions as forcefully as he once had. A pause that lasted a second too long. A sentence finished differently than expected. Sal recognized the signs immediately. He had spent his life reading silence. He did not react outwardly. Reaction would have sent panic racing through the system. Instead, he adjusted internally, assuming compromise and moving accordingly. Routes were altered. Contacts cut. Information sealed away. The system absorbed the wound without showing it. But wounds spread. Prosecutors understood pressure as well as Sal did. They did not need mass betrayal. They needed a foothold. One cooperating witness could justify surveillance. Surveillance could justify more charges. More charges created more fear. Fear created more cooperation. It was a cycle, and Sal could feel it accelerating. Men who had once spoken confidently now chose words carefully. Some spoke too carefully. Others spoke too freely, as if daring fate to intervene. Sal watched both with equal concern. Extremes were dangerous. The pressure changed the meaning of time. Days stretched. Weeks blurred. Court dates loomed like weather systems that could not be avoided, only endured. Sal noticed how men aged visibly under this weight. Hair thinned. Shoulders slumped. Eyes dulled. He understood then that betrayal would not come from malice. It would come from fatigue. The prosecutors exploited this expertly. They did not rush interrogations. They let time work. They allowed defendants to sit with the reality of their situation. Long sentences described in calm voices. Charts showing years stacked upon years. The message was not shouted. It was whispered. Sal reinforced support systems immediately. Legal fees covered. Families assisted. Quiet reassurance delivered indirectly. He knew that abandonment accelerated betrayal. Support slowed it. But support could not erase fear. The second betrayal was clearer than the first. A rumor confirmed. A detail surfaced in a context where it should not have existed. Sal traced it carefully, mapping knowledge backward until the source revealed itself. The man had not spoken extensively. Not yet. But the door had opened. Sal closed the corresponding doors on his side. Permanently. He did not confront the man. Confrontation created drama. Drama created noise. Instead, he removed relevance. The man was cut off from information entirely. He became operationally dead while still physically present. This containment strategy worked temporarily, but pressure does not respect boundaries. It finds new paths. As more indictments followed, the pool of vulnerable men grew. Not everyone faced the same risk. Some charges carried decades. Others carried less. The imbalance created resentment. Resentment bred rationalization. Sal heard the justifications indirectly. They were always framed as necessity. Doing what was best for family. Correcting an imbalance. Avoiding unjust punishment. No one framed betrayal as selfishness. Everyone framed it as survival. Sal did not judge these narratives. He simply noted them. Judgment wasted energy. He understood that loyalty was easiest when it cost little. Now loyalty cost everything. The prosecutors sensed momentum building. They began moving faster, more aggressively. Offers made. Deadlines imposed. Choices forced. Sal felt the squeeze intensify. He responded by reducing exposure even further. He stopped seeking information altogether unless it was essential. Knowing less protected him. Ignorance was not weakness. It was armor. But ignorance could not protect others. Men who had once been comfortable cogs now realized they were visible pieces. Their importance frightened them. Fear made them unpredictable. Sal maintained his composure publicly. Privately, he felt the weight of inevitability grow heavier. Betrayal was no longer hypothetical. It was statistical. He began calculating not whether betrayal would occur, but how much damage it could do. He reviewed every major decision he had made over the years, assessing its vulnerability under testimony. Who knew what? Who could connect which dots? Which narratives could be assembled? He realized that while the system was fragmented, memory was not. Men remembered more than they realized. Under pressure, memory reorganized itself into stories prosecutors could use. Sal also understood that betrayal changed relationships permanently, even if it did not lead directly to convictions. Suspicion lingered. Trust evaporated. The system could survive arrests. It could not survive paranoia unchecked. He worked constantly to prevent internal collapse. He discouraged speculation. He discouraged accusations. He reminded people indirectly that panic was contagious. Still, fear spread. The third betrayal was louder than the others. It surfaced not through rumor, but through action. A subpoena expanded. Questions sharpened. Investigators referenced knowledge they should not have had. Sal felt a cold clarity settle in. The dam had cracked. He adjusted his strategy again. Now it was no longer about prevention. It was about limitation. Damage control. He isolated critical areas completely. Shut down operations that could not be adequately protected. Sacrificed revenue streams without hesitation. Money was replaceable. Freedom was not. The betrayals also forced Sal to confront an uncomfortable truth. His strength had always been distance. Distance now insulated him personally, but left others exposed. That imbalance created resentment, even among loyal men. He understood their perspective. He did not apologize for it. Leadership meant survival first. Without leadership, nothing remained. The prosecutors understood hierarchy instinctively. They aimed to flip men closest to power, not necessarily because those men knew the most, but because their cooperation carried symbolic weight. Sal countered this by making proximity meaningless. He flattened perceived hierarchy. He ensured that no one could convincingly claim intimate access to decision-making. Distance became policy. He also noticed that betrayal did not always produce truth. Sometimes it produced fiction. Men filled gaps in their knowledge with assumptions. Prosecutors accepted these assumptions if they fit the narrative. Sal saw the danger in this. False certainty could be as damaging as accurate testimony. He adjusted defenses accordingly, preparing to challenge credibility relentlessly. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation. Everyone sensed that the next phase would be decisive. Trials approached. Plea deals multiplied. Cooperation agreements solidified. Sal withdrew further. He limited his movements, reduced his visibility. He did not hide, but he did not linger. Presence was carefully rationed. He also prepared emotionally for loss. Loss of people, loss of relationships, loss of identity. He did not indulge grief. Grief clouded focus. The betrayals reshaped the moral landscape of the organization. Old codes felt irrelevant. New codes emerged, centered around self-preservation. Sal resisted romanticizing the past. The past was gone. He adapted to the present with the same discipline he always had. One betrayal led to another, not because men were evil, but because pressure compounds. Each cooperation emboldened prosecutors and frightened the next man in line. The cycle fed itself. Sal focused on slowing it, not stopping it. Slowing bought time. Time allowed adjustment. He strengthened legal strategies to account for cooperative witnesses. He emphasized inconsistency, memory flaws, incentives to lie. He knew juries could be persuaded to doubt, but doubt required coherence. Too much betrayal risked creating a consistent narrative against him. Sal worked tirelessly to prevent that coherence from forming. The strain affected him personally. Sleep shortened. Thoughts looped. He did not share this with anyone. Sharing created vulnerability. He reminded himself that betrayal was not new. History was filled with it. Systems survived by anticipating it, not denying it. He had anticipated it, perhaps not its scale, but its inevitability. As more men chose self-preservation over silence, the operation shrank further. What remained was quieter, leaner, more defensive. Sal accepted this transformation. He understood that the era of expansion was over. The era of endurance had begun. The betrayals under pressure did not destroy the system immediately, but they changed its nature permanently. Trust became conditional. Silence became strategic rather than sacred. Sal stood in the center of this shifting landscape, absorbing pressure without outward reaction. He knew that the next chapter would not be defined by what he built, but by what he managed to preserve. Because betrayal, once unleashed, could not be undone. It could only be survived. And survival, he knew, would demand choices even harder than silence. Chapter 13, Trials, Testimony, and the Shattering Illusion. The courtroom did not feel real at first. Not to the men who sat inside it, and not to Sal Gambino, who understood long before the first witness spoke that this room was not about truth. It was about replacement. The illusion that had protected everything for years was being traded for another illusion, one made of procedure, oaths, and carefully constructed stories. The pizza connection was no longer a system. It was a narrative. Sal had always believed that invisibility was the strongest defense. Trials proved otherwise. Trials created focus. They forced attention into narrow corridors where every movement echoed. Invisibility no longer meant safety. It meant suspicion. The first day of testimony carried a weight that had nothing to do with evidence. It was the weight of finality. Once spoken aloud, the story could not be taken back. Once written into transcripts, words gained permanence. Sal understood that permanence was the true enemy. Witnesses took the stand one by one, each carrying a version of the past shaped by fear, bargaining, and survival. Some spoke confidently. Others trembled. None spoke without motive. Sal listened to reports of their testimony, not with anger, but with analysis. What mattered was not what they said, but how it fit together. The prosecution understood structure better than any single witness ever could. They stitched fragmented memories into a cohesive arc. They smoothed contradictions. They emphasized repetition. Repetition created belief. Belief created conviction. Sal saw how easily complexity collapsed under storytelling. Years of compartmentalization were flattened into a single narrative thread. Sicily to America. Pizza to heroin. Ordinary businesses to extraordinary crime. The elegance of the story frightened him more than its accuracy. Jurors did not need to understand logistics. They needed to understand intention. The prosecution framed intention clearly. Everything had been designed. Everything had been coordinated. Everything had been deliberate. Sal knew that this framing was dangerous precisely because it was partially true. Defense attorneys worked tirelessly to dismantle the narrative. They questioned memory, highlighted inconsistencies, exposed incentives. But doubt was a fragile thing. It required patience. Prosecutors relied on momentum. Each cooperating witness added texture to the story. One spoke of routes, another of meetings, another of money. None of them alone could prove much. Together, they painted a picture that felt complete. Sal understood the psychology at play. Humans trusted patterns. The mind filled gaps automatically. Jurors connected dots, even when instructed not to. Once the illusion shattered, rebuilding it was nearly impossible. The illusion that had shattered was not innocence. It was distance. The belief that leadership could remain abstract while consequences remained concrete. Trials made everything personal. Names were spoken. Faces displayed. Charts drawn. The system that had once thrived on invisibility now existed under fluorescent lights, stripped of subtlety. Sal remained absent from the proceedings physically, but present in every implication. He had become an idea. Ideas were harder to defend than people. He monitored testimony obsessively, not for emotion, but for alignment. Which witnesses corroborated each other unintentionally? Which stories overlapped too neatly? Which details were emphasized repeatedly? Emphasis revealed strategy. He noticed prosecutors returning again and again to the same themes. Control, coordination, design. They wanted jurors to believe that nothing was accidental, that every action pointed upward. Sal had anticipated this, but anticipation did not soften the impact. The illusion of chaos had protected the system. Order now threatened it. The defense attempted to restore chaos. They emphasized fragmentation, independent actors, coincidence. They argued that prosecutors were imposing meaning where none existed. Sal knew this argument was fragile. People hated coincidence. Testimony dragged on for weeks. Fatigue set in. Fatigue favored the prosecution. Simpler narratives survived exhaustion better than complex ones. Sal felt the weight of time pressing in from both sides. The longer the trial lasted, the more opportunities for error. The shorter it lasted, the less time to dismantle assumptions. Witnesses broke down on the stand. Some cried. Some hardened. Emotion played well to jurors. Sal understood this too. Emotion replaced evidence when evidence felt overwhelming. He thought often about the men who testified, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Each had faced a choice no one prepared for. Loyalty versus survival. Silence versus decades in prison. Sal had never promised anyone safety. He had promised structure. Structure had failed them. The illusion that shattered most violently was the belief that discipline could override human weakness indefinitely. Trials exposed weakness publicly. They rewarded it. Cooperation became virtue. Silence became guilt. Sal understood that the system had crossed a cultural threshold. The old code no longer held power. The courtroom had its own code, and it was enforced ruthlessly. As testimony accumulated, the pizza connection transformed in the public imagination. No longer a clever disguise. No longer an invisible system. It became a symbol. Symbols were dangerous. Symbols demanded punishment. Sal watched from a distance as prosecutors leaned into that symbolism. Pizza boxes displayed as exhibits. Menus referenced. Ordinary objects recontextualized as tools of destruction. The contrast was effective. Comfort turned into menace. He recognized the brilliance of this approach, even as it threatened him. People responded to betrayal of the familiar. The idea that something trusted had been corrupted provoked outrage. Defense attorneys struggled to counter this emotional framing. Logic fought emotion poorly in crowded rooms. Sal adjusted his expectations. Acquittal was no longer a realistic goal across the board. The goal became mitigation, fragmentation, survival of pieces rather than the whole. He focused on which charges mattered most, which precedents would be set, which interpretations would endure. Trials were not just about verdicts. They were about language that future prosecutors would reuse. He paid close attention to judicial rulings. What evidence was allowed? What testimony excluded? These decisions shaped the battlefield. Sal evaluated them with the same precision he once applied to routes and shipments. The illusion shattered further as cooperating witnesses revealed internal dynamics, disputes, power struggles, disagreements. The prosecution used these moments to humanize the organization. Humanization made guilt relatable. Sal understood the irony. He had spent years dehumanizing operations to preserve them. Now humanity was being weaponized. The defense attempted to exploit the same humanity, emphasizing coercion, fear, manipulation. But coercion did not erase responsibility. It complicated it. Complication did not play well to tired jurors. As weeks turned into months, the psychological toll became evident. Faces in the courtroom aged. Voices grew hoarse. Tension settled into something heavier. Anticipation gave way to dread. Sal felt a strange calm amid this. The uncertainty that had haunted earlier phases was gone. This was clarity. Brutal, but clear. The illusion was shattered. Now came consequence. He thought about legacy differently now. Not reputation, but precedent. What would remain after verdicts? How history would remember the system he had helped shape. He knew that history favored simplicity. The pizza connection would be remembered as a singular scheme, not a constellation of decisions made under pressure. Sal accepted that distortion as inevitable. The jury deliberated behind closed doors, unseen but omnipresent. Their absence was louder than testimony. Sal imagined them replaying arguments, weighing credibility, assembling their own narratives. He understood that jurors did not decide guilt or innocence. They decided which story felt truer. The verdicts, when they came, landed unevenly. Some convictions, some partial victories, some defeats. Sal absorbed the news without visible reaction. He had prepared for this outcome emotionally long before. The illusion shattered completely at sentencing. Years pronounced aloud. Numbers that transformed abstract risk into concrete loss. Lives recalibrated in seconds. Sal felt the finality settle. Not despair. Not anger. Acceptance. The system that had once thrived on silence was now immortalized in transcripts, exhibits, and case law. It could no longer hide. It could only be studied. Sal understood then that trials were not the end. They were transformation. The pizza connection would survive not as an operation, but as a warning, a lesson, a template others would misunderstand. The illusion of invisibility was gone forever. What remained was resilience. Sal turned his focus inward, to survival beyond narrative, to existence beyond exposure. The world had named what he had tried to keep unnamed. He could not undo that. He could only endure what followed. And what followed, he knew, would demand a different kind of silence than the one that had built everything in the first place. Chapter 14. Collapse without collapse. The strange thing about the end was how much it resembled continuity. There was no single day when everything stopped. No final shipment seized that made the phones go quiet forever. No moment where the machine simply shut down and went dark. What happened instead was slower, heavier, more disorienting. The structure did not explode. It sagged. And in that sag, Sal Gambino recognized a truth he had always understood but never needed to confront so directly. Systems like this did not end. They eroded. After the trials, after the sentences, after the headlines moved on to the next crisis, the streets did not suddenly become empty. Pizza shops still opened their doors. Trucks still rolled through ports. Men still woke up early and went to work. On the surface, life looked unchanged. That was the most unsettling part. Collapse did not arrive as absence. It arrived as thinning. Sal felt it in the quiet spaces where decisions used to live. Calls that were no longer returned. Names that could no longer be spoken. Routes that technically existed but no longer felt safe to use. The system still functioned, but its confidence was gone. Confidence had been the invisible glue holding everything together. What replaced it was caution, so intense it bordered on paralysis. Men who had survived the trials carried a new weight. Not fear of arrest alone, but fear of being remembered. Every action now came with an imagined courtroom attached to it. Every conversation felt like testimony waiting to happen. Sal understood this psychological shift immediately. The illusion of anonymity had died. And without that illusion, the machine could not move the way it once had. The organization did not implode because it did not know how to implode. It had been built to adapt, not surrender. Pieces fell away quietly. A shop closed and never reopened. A supplier retired early. A route simply stopped being used, not because it was compromised, but because it felt too familiar. Familiarity had become dangerous. Sal watched this process unfold with a detached clarity that surprised even him. He had prepared for arrest. He had prepared for betrayal. He had prepared for trial. What he had not fully prepared for was stagnation. Stagnation was worse than chaos. Chaos forced decisions. Stagnation invited decay. Men argued less now, not because they agreed, but because no one wanted to speak first. Leadership felt radioactive. Authority attracted attention. Attention led to scrutiny. Scrutiny led back to courtrooms. Sal understood that power had inverted. Where once it protected, now it endangered. He adjusted again, not by rebuilding, but by releasing control. He allowed fragments to drift apart naturally. He did not try to impose order where order would only invite focus. Letting go became strategy. The pizza connection, once a tightly coordinated network, became a loose constellation of habits, memories, and residual relationships. Some elements survived independently. Others withered quickly. Sal did not mourn their passing. Mourning implied attachment. Attachment clouded judgment. What mattered was survivability. He noticed how younger men, those who had entered late, struggled the most. They had never known the system at its strongest. They had tasted profit without learning patience. Now they faced restriction without understanding restraint. Some left. Some made mistakes. Some disappeared into obscurity. Sal allowed this attrition. Natural selection did what enforcement no longer needed to. The older men adapted better. They had seen cycles before. They understood that silence was not just protection, but retreat. Retreat preserved options. Options preserved life. Money still moved, but differently. Smaller amounts. Slower rhythms. No ambition. Sal encouraged this transformation quietly. Growth was no longer a goal. Stability was. He redirected resources into legitimacy where possible. Not to clean consciences, but to clean ledgers. Businesses that had once been fronts now became actual livelihoods. This shift felt almost surreal. The same structures that had hidden crime now hid survival. Sal did not pretend this was redemption. It was camouflage of a different kind. Law enforcement attention did not disappear, but it softened. Major victories had been declared. Careers advanced. Budgets redirected. Sal understood that institutions, like criminal systems, suffered from fatigue. Once a story concluded publicly, it lost urgency. That loss of urgency created space. Narrow, fragile, but real. Sal moved carefully within that space. He avoided rebuilding anything that resembled the past. Nostalgia was dangerous. It tempted repetition. Repetition invited recognition. He also noticed something unexpected. The absence of constant crisis felt unsettling. For years, pressure had dictated rhythm. Now, the rhythm slowed, and with it came a strange emptiness. Men had defined themselves by the system. Without it, they felt unmoored. Sal did not offer them purpose. Purpose invited organization. Organization invited exposure. Instead, he encouraged distance, fragmentation, individual paths. Some took the hint. Others resisted. Those who resisted eventually collided with reality on their own. The collapse without collapse altered the Mafia's internal mythology. The pizza connection was no longer spoken of as innovation. It was spoken of as cautionary tale, a reminder that success carried consequences beyond profit. Sal listened to these reframings with mild interest. He did not correct them. History rewrote itself regardless of accuracy. He felt the weight of years settle into his body. Not age, but accumulation. Decisions layered upon decisions. Consequences layered upon consequences. He carried them quietly. The silence around him changed too. It was no longer strategic. It was reflective. The kind of silence that arrives after noise has exhausted itself. Sal found this silence more honest. He spent more time alone, not hiding, just removed. He observed rather than directed. Observation required less energy. Energy needed preservation. He understood now that collapse was not a moment, but a condition. The condition of being unable to return to what once was. That realization freed him in unexpected ways. He no longer needed to maintain the illusion of continuity. The past had ended. The future would be smaller. Sal accepted this without regret. The pizza connection had reshaped the landscape irrevocably. Even in collapse, its imprint remained. New systems would rise in its shadow. Others would study it, misunderstand it, replicate fragments of it poorly. Sal did not care. What mattered was that the era had closed. He thought often about Sicily now. Not the place, but the philosophy. Patience, restraint, acceptance of limits. Those values had been drowned out during expansion. Now they returned, not as ideals, but as necessities. Collapse without collapse meant living among ruins that still functioned. Knowing what once stood tall while pretending nothing had changed. It required discipline of a different kind. Sal adapted to that discipline. He avoided reflection too long or too deeply. Reflection invited sentiment. Sentiment invited mistakes. Instead, he focused on the present moment, on what could still be controlled, on what no longer needed to be. The organization no longer revolved around him, and that was intentional. Central figures attracted attention. Sal preferred to become peripheral. He allowed others to believe they were independent. Independence reduced pressure on him. Pressure reduction extended survival. The collapse did not bring closure. It brought ambiguity. Ambiguity was safer than certainty. Sal lived within that ambiguity carefully, quietly, patiently. The machine had slowed to a crawl, but it had not stopped. It might never fully stop. It would simply fade, replaced by something else, shaped by different hands, haunted by the same lessons. Sal did not plan for legacy. Legacy was a story told by people who needed endings. He understood that endings were illusions. There were only transitions. And this transition, though heavy, was survivable. The collapse had come without collapse. The noise was gone. The damage remained. And Sal Gambino moved forward into a smaller, quieter world, knowing that silence had saved him once and might still save him again if he listened closely enough. Chapter 15. Legacy in Silence. In the end, there was no final reckoning, no cinematic moment where everything converged into clarity. Sal Gambino understood this better than anyone. Real power, he had learned, rarely received an ending worthy of its scale. It dissolved instead, slipping into memory, rumor, and footnotes, leaving behind effects that outlived the men who caused them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with consequence. Sal lived in that silence now. The world had moved on in visible ways. New crises dominated headlines. New enemies replaced old ones. Law enforcement units that had once dedicated entire careers to dismantling the pizza connection were reassigned, retired, or promoted. Their investigations became case studies, citations in training manuals, warnings told to new recruits who listened with the same confidence youth always carried. The machine of attention turned elsewhere, as it always did. But the imprint remained. Sal felt it in the way conversations stopped just short of certain topics, in the way men lowered their voices instinctively when speaking about the past, even when there was no one left to hear. The pizza connection had become a ghost story, told carefully, always ending with the same lesson. Too big, too visible, too successful. Success had been the original sin. Sal reflected on that irony often, though never aloud. He had not built a system to dominate history. He had built it to survive it. That it had grown beyond those intentions was both its triumph and its undoing. The silence around him deepened with time, but it was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of acceptance. Those who remained understood the boundaries now. They had learned what the system could not survive. They had learned what visibility cost. Sal did not issue these lessons. He embodied them. He moved through life without urgency. Urgency belonged to men still chasing something. Sal no longer chased. He observed. Observation required patience. Patience had always been his greatest weapon. He thought about Sicily often, not with longing, but with clarity. Sicily had taught him that power was generational, not individual. That men came and went, but structures endured until they collapsed under their own weight. The pizza connection had collapsed not because it was weak, but because it had outgrown the shadows that protected it. That lesson would outlive him. Sal knew his name would never carry the same public weight as others. He would not be mythologized the way louder men were. That suited him. Myth attracted attention. Attention rewrote history in crude strokes. His legacy would be quieter, harder to trace, embedded in the methods others avoided and the mistakes others repeated. He had become, in effect, a negative example, a system remembered not for how it began, but for how it ended. That, too, was a form of influence. The men who had survived the trials and the collapse aged differently afterward. Some tried to recreate fragments of the old system in smaller forms. Most failed. They misunderstood what had made it work. They copied the surface, not the discipline beneath it. Sal watched these attempts without interference. Interference invited relevance. Relevance invited scrutiny. He understood now that survival did not require rebuilding. It required restraint. The neighborhoods once flooded with heroin carried scars that did not fade easily. Addiction did not vanish with prosecutions. Communities rebuilt slowly, unevenly. Sal was not blind to this damage. He simply understood that acknowledgement changed nothing now. The harm had already escaped the boundaries of intention. That realization haunted him more than guilt ever could. Guilt implied choice. Consequence implied inevitability. Sal lived with consequence. He noticed how time softened even the sharpest narratives. The pizza connection, once framed as a singular evil, gradually became a historical anomaly, something that belonged to a different era. New threats replaced it. New methods emerged. New networks learned from its mistakes, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unknowingly. Sal did not believe in progress. He believed in cycles. The cycle had turned. He found himself increasingly alone, not because others had abandoned him, but because solitude was safer. Fewer connections meant fewer vulnerabilities. Fewer vulnerabilities meant fewer regrets. He did not confuse solitude with loneliness. Loneliness wanted company. Solitude demanded awareness. Sal spent his days quietly, engaged in routines that appeared unremarkable. That was intentional. Ordinary life was the ultimate disguise, not because it hid crime, but because it hid history. People rarely questioned what looked familiar. The irony did not escape him. He remembered moments from decades earlier with surprising clarity. Conversations held in half-light. Decisions made without ceremony. The subtle thrill of a system functioning smoothly. He did not dwell on these memories. Dwelling risked sentiment. Sentiment belonged to men who still believed the past could be reclaimed. Sal knew better. The legal aftermath continued long after the trials ended. Appeals, sentencing adjustments, parole hearings. He followed these developments distantly, like weather reports from a region he no longer lived in. They mattered, but not in ways he could influence. Influence had shifted. He had once shaped outcomes through foresight and discipline. Now outcomes shaped him through limitation. This reversal did not bother him. He adapted to it naturally. Adaptation was his nature. He observed how the Mafia itself changed in the aftermath. Less centralized, more cautious, less ambitious. The old romanticism faded, replaced by pragmatism bordering on cynicism. Sal recognized this as evolution, not decay. Evolution required sacrifice. He had been one of those sacrifices, though not publicly. His anonymity, once a strength, now ensured that history would only glimpse him through inference. That suited him. He had never wanted to be remembered. The Pizza Connection's legacy persisted most strongly in law enforcement. Training programs emphasized its scale, its ingenuity, its downfall. Analysts dissected it endlessly, extracting principles, warning signs, vulnerabilities. Sal found this mildly amusing. They studied a system frozen in time, unaware that its greatest strength had been adaptability. They would always be chasing ghosts. Sal understood that future systems would never look exactly the same. They would evolve around surveillance, around technology, around global pressure. But the core lesson would remain unchanged. Visibility killed. He hoped, quietly, that lesson would be remembered. As years passed, Sal's role in the story receded further. Names faded. Faces blurred. New generations knew the Pizza Connection as an abstraction, not an experience. That distance softened its impact. Sal accepted that too. Legacy, he realized, was not about recognition. It was about influence without attribution, about shaping outcomes long after one's direct involvement ended. In that sense, the silence around him was not absence. It was evidence. He had lived long enough to see how systems collapsed, not because of enemies, but because of success. How invisibility could not survive attention. How discipline could not withstand greed indefinitely. He carried these lessons quietly, like scars that did not ache anymore. When Sal thought about death, it was not with fear. It was with curiosity. He wondered whether the silence he had cultivated would persist after he was gone, or whether history would finally attach his name to the shadows he had inhabited. He did not care either way. Names were temporary. Consequences were not. He understood that the Pizza Connection had altered the balance of power in ways no trial could fully undo. It had reshaped trafficking models. It had forced law enforcement to adapt. It had accelerated international cooperation. Its collapse had taught both sides what limits looked like. That was its true legacy. Sal had been part of that, whether history chose to acknowledge it or not. He spent more time, now, reflecting on restraint than ambition, on knowing when to stop rather than how to continue. These were lessons he wished others had learned sooner. But regret did not serve him. He focused instead on the present moment, on quiet mornings, on the absence of sirens, on the simplicity of days without planning for contingencies. This simplicity felt earned. The world outside continued to spin, indifferent to his presence. Sal welcomed that indifference. It meant he had succeeded in his final objective, to disappear. The Pizza Connection would live on in books, documentaries, lectures. It would be dissected, dramatized, misunderstood. Sal would remain a shadow behind it, a name rarely spoken, a figure inferred rather than described. That anonymity was not an accident. It was the culmination of everything he had ever done. In the end, Sal Gambino left no manifesto, no confession, no explanation. He understood that explanations invited judgment, and judgment invited simplification. His story ended the way it had always been told, quietly. And in that quiet, the legacy endured, not as noise, not as spectacle, but as a warning etched into the margins of history. Power that hides too well eventually teaches others how to look. Sal had learned that lesson late, but he had learned it completely, and the silence that followed was the only ending he ever wanted.